My name is Thomas Gallagher. I am 68 years old and I am a retired heavy-duty diesel mechanic. I used to believe that a father's unconditional love could build an impenetrable fortress around his family. I thought every drop of sweat and every broken bone I endured was an investment into a legacy of trust and warmth. But I was terribly wrong. The people you bleed for can sometimes be the very ones holding the knife behind your back. I froze outside the back door of my own daughter's house as her voice turned cold, talking about my money like I was already buried in the ground. Then she mentioned a plan, one that made my blood run freezing cold. I heard everything that night, and the vengeance I unleashed was something they will never ever forget. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that nobody should ever mess with a protective grandfather. It was a miserable, rainy Sunday night in the Chicago suburbs. The kind of freezing rain that chills you right down to the marrow and makes your joints ache. I had just finished having Sunday dinner over at my daughter Chloe and my son-in-law Jamal's house. I love those weekly dinners because I got to spend time with my beautiful 7-year-old granddaughter Lily. She is my absolute world and the only light in my old age. I had kissed little Lily goodnight, hugged. Chloe shook Jamal's hand and driven about 10 minutes down the dark highway, before I realized the cup holder in my truck was completely empty. I had left my cell phone sitting right there on their kitchen island. I turned my heavy truck around and drove back. The rain was coming down in thick sheets, drumming heavily against my windshield. When I pulled up to their driveway, I made a decision not to ring the front doorbell. I did not want to wake up little Lily, who had school the next morning. I knew the side gate of their yard was always unlocked, so I figured I could just walk around to the back porch, tap lightly on the kitchen window, and have Jamal simply hand me the phone through the glass. I walked quietly across the wet grass, my heavy work boots squishing slightly in the mud. I stepped up onto the wooden deck of the back porch. The kitchen light was still glowing brightly. The sliding glass window was cracked open just a couple of inches to let out the thick smoke from the roast Jamal had accidentally burned earlier that evening. I raised my heavy hand to tap on the wet glass, but my knuckles never touched the pane. I stopped dead in my tracks. I heard laughter. It was not the warm family laughter we had just shared over dinner. It was a sharp, calculating, and cruel sound. I leaned in closer to the narrow gap in the window. The freezing rain soaked right through my canvas jacket, but I could not feel the bitter cold anymore. I could only feel a sudden icy dread spreading deep inside my chest. Chloe was standing by the sink, swirling a glass of expensive red wine. Jamal was leaning against the marble counter, tapping away on a screen. He was holding my cell phone, the very phone I had come back to retrieve. Jamal chuckled loudly and spoke. "The old man does not even lock his phone, Chloe. I am looking right at his banking application right now. The balances are just sitting there. $2 million between the retirement accounts and the life insurance policy. $2 million, baby." I held my breath. I fully expected my daughter to scold him. I expected Chloe, the little girl I had raised with my own 2 calloused hands, after her mother passed away, to tell her husband to put her father's property down and show some basic respect. Instead, she took a long sip of her wine and smiled a smile I did not recognize. "I know," she said. Her voice sounded so foreign, so deeply cynical and greedy. "It is just sitting there, gathering dust while he plays with greasy truck engines in his dirty garage. We need that money now, Jamal. Not in 10 years. Not when he finally drops dead. We cannot keep living like this, paycheck to paycheck." Jamal ran his hand over his face, looking suddenly desperate. "The creditors are calling me every single day, Chloe. If I do not come up with $500,000 soon, those guys from the underground sports book are going to find me and break my legs. I am drowning here. We need his accounts cleared out by the end of the month, or we are finished." My heart hammered violently against my ribs. Sportsbook. Creditors. Jamal had always played the part of the highly successful real estate agent. He wore tailored suits and drove a leased luxury car. I had even paid the massive down payment on the very house they were standing in right now. Now I was finding out my seemingly perfect son-in-law was $500,000 in debt to dangerous illegal gamblers. But the absolute worst part was yet to come. The betrayal that completely shattered my soul and tore my world apart came directly from my own flesh and blood. Do not panic, Chloe told him, setting her wine glass down on the counter with a sharp clink. I have been laying the groundwork for weeks. You know my sister-in-law Tasha runs that private assisted living facility. Tasha and I already talked and figured it all out. We just need to make it look like Dad is completely losing his mind. Once we get a corrupt doctor to sign off that he has severe dementia and cannot manage his own affairs, we can trigger a forced conservatorship. I will become his legal guardian. I will get full control of the estate, the house, the bank accounts, absolutely everything. Jamal looked up, a greedy and sickening grin spreading across his face. And what about the old man? Chloe shrugged, completely devoid of any human emotion. Tasha will give him a locked room in the back ward of her facility. She knows some doctors who will keep him heavily medicated so he does not make a fuss. He will not even know what day it is. We will sell his house, pay off your gambling debts, and the rest of the millions are ours to enjoy in peace. I stood there in the pouring rain, completely unable to breathe. My lungs felt like they were filling with heavy lead. My own daughter. The girl I had worked grueling double shifts for, the girl I had sacrificed my knees and my back for, was standing 10 feet away, calmly planning to lock me in a drugged stupor, just to steal my life savings. She wanted to erase me from existence. I backed away from the window slowly and silently. I did not knock. I did not scream or yell. A lesser man might have kicked the back door down and started swinging his fists. But 40 years of fixing massive diesel engines teaches you a thing or two about patience and strategy. You do not just hit a broken machine with a hammer in a blind rage. You step back, you diagnose the problem, you gather your heavy tools, and you take the whole thing apart, piece by very piece. They thought they were dealing with a weak, senile old man who would just roll over and disappear. They had absolutely no idea they had just declared a brutal war on a father who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. I stood frozen on that wet wooden deck as the freezing rain continued to soak through my heavy canvas jacket. I thought hearing my own daughter plot to steal my life savings was the absolute bottom of the barrel. I thought the betrayal could not possibly cut any deeper than that. But as I pressed my ear closer to the narrow gap in the sliding glass window, I realized the theft of my money was only the beginning of their sickening plan. The true depth of their cruelty was about to be laid bare, and it involved the one person in this world I loved more than life itself. My sweet 7-year-old granddaughter, Lily. Jamal poured himself a glass of bourbon and took a large gulp. He leaned against the marble counter and let out a heavy sigh that sounded almost annoyed. He looked at Chloe and crossed his arms. "And what about the kid?" he asked. "We cannot exactly live our best life and travel the world blowing through $2 million if we have to drag a second grader everywhere we go. She is always crying about wanting to see her grandpa anyway. She is going to be a massive problem once we lock him away." I waited for Chloe to slap him. I waited for the fierce protective instinct of a mother to rise up and defend her only child. Instead, my daughter simply rolled her eyes and took another sip of her expensive red wine. "I already handled it," she said in a tone so casual it made my stomach violently churn. "I found a cheap boarding school 2 states over in Missouri. It is practically in the middle of nowhere. We pay the bottom tier tuition for the whole year up front, drop her off after the holidays, and we do not have to deal with parent-teacher conferences, packed lunches, or bedtime stories anymore. We can finally be free." The words hit me harder than a physical blow to the chest. Free. My daughter considered her own flesh and blood a burden to be discarded. Lily was a bright, loving little girl who painted me pictures of yellow sunflowers and fell asleep on my chest while I read her fairy tales. To them, she was just an obstacle standing in the way of their luxury vacations and designer clothes. They were planning to exile an innocent child to some dreary, low-budget institution hundreds of miles away from everything she knew, just so they could play rich with money they did not earn. My hands curled into tight fists. The grease-stained knuckles popped in the cold night air. The urge to break through that glass and tear Jamal apart with my bare hands was almost blinding, but I forced myself to remain completely still. I needed to hear the rest. Jamal laughed, a harsh and greedy sound that echoed in the warm kitchen. "That is my brilliant wife," he said, walking over to kiss her cheek. "But we have to make sure the old man is completely neutralized first. If he gets even a hint of what we are doing with Lily, he will hire lawyers. He will fight us for custody. You know how obsessed he is with that kid. Chloe waved her hand dismissively. He will not be able to hire anyone, she said with a cold smirk. He will not even have the legal right to buy a cup of coffee by the time my sister-in-law is done with him. Have you talked to Tasha today? Jamal nodded eagerly. Yeah, Tasha is completely on board. She says the timing is perfect. Tasha, Jamal's older sister, was the director of a private assisted living facility across town. I had only met her a handful of times, but she always had cold, calculating eyes. Now those eyes were set on my freedom. Jamal continued detailing the horrific scheme. Tasha has a doctor on her payroll who owes her a massive favor, Jamal explained. He is a specialist. Next Friday, we are going to tell your dad we are taking him to a routine checkup because we are worried about his memory. The doctor will evaluate him and officially diagnose him with severe rapid onset dementia. He will write a sworn medical affidavit stating that Thomas Gallagher is completely incompetent and a danger to himself. Chloe smiled, her eyes gleaming with absolute malice. And then we take that paper straight to a judge, she added. We file for an emergency forced conservatorship. The court will strip him of all his legal rights and appoint me as his sole guardian. I will have total control over his pension, his retirement accounts, his house, and his health care. He will legally become a ghost. I felt the icy rain mixing with the hot tears of pure rage streaming down my weathered face. A conservatorship. They were not just going to rob me. They were going to erase me. They were going to use the legal system to declare me mentally dead while I was still breathing. I would have no voice, no rights, and no way to protect my little Lily. Jamal chuckled again, finishing his bourbon. Tasha said she will have a room waiting for him in the lockdown ward of her facility, the ward where they keep the patients who wander off. She promised to keep him heavily medicated on sedatives so he stays quiet and compliant. He will spend the rest of his short life staring at a blank wall, drooling into a cup, while we finally get the life we deserve. The sheer scale of their evil was suffocating. This was a highly coordinated, multi-layered conspiracy. Jamal needed my money to pay off his dangerous gambling debts to the underground sportsbook. Chloe wanted a life of endless luxury without the burden of being a mother. And Tasha was using her medical credentials to facilitate the ultimate kidnapping and robbery. They had it all figured out. They thought they had backed an old, tired mechanic into a corner from which he could never escape. I slowly took a step back from the window. The rain washed away the mud from my heavy boots. The shock and the heartbreak that had paralyzed me just moments ago were completely gone. In their place was a cold, hard, and terrifying resolve. I did not care about the $2 million. Money was just paper and metal. But they were coming for my freedom, and they were coming for my granddaughter. I turned around and walked quietly back to my truck in the pouring rain. I climbed into the cab, gripping the heavy steering wheel with both hands. I stared through the wet windshield at their bright, warm house. You want to see a ghost? I whispered into the empty cab. I will show you a ghost. I started the heavy diesel engine. It roared to life like a sleeping beast finally waking up. I put the truck in gear and drove away into the dark night. I was not going to hire a lawyer just yet. I was going to build a trap so devastating, so inescapable, that when the hammer finally fell, they would curse the day they ever decided to mess with an old mechanic's family. The war had just begun. For 40 years, the smell of heavy diesel fuel was my everyday cologne. It seeped deep into my skin, lived permanently under my fingernails, and settled so deep into the thick fibers of my work clothes that no amount of industrial soap could ever wash it away. I was a heavy-duty diesel mechanic in the industrial heart of Chicago. If you have never laid flat on your back on a frozen concrete floor in the dead of January, with the bitter wind howling off Lake Michigan and cutting through the garage bays, trying to coax a frozen transmission out of a massive 18-wheeler, you simply do not know the true meaning of cold. I worked the graveyard shift, night after lonely night, while the rest of the city was tucked warmly into their comfortable beds. I was trapped under thousands of pounds of freezing steel. I hauled heavy steel wrenches the size of my forearm, lifting them above my head for hours on end until my shoulders screamed in agonizing pain. I busted my knuckles open on rusted bolts until they bled, wrapping my torn skin in dirty electrical tape, just so I could finish the job and clock my precious overtime. That garage was a brutal, unforgiving place. The constant noise of giant air compressors and heavy impact guns was deafening. The grease was thick and black coating absolutely everything I touched. But to me, that grimy, freezing garage was a holy place. It was the sacred place where I traded my sweat, my blood, and my youth for my daughter's future. My beautiful wife Sarah passed away when Chloe was only 4 years old. It was a vicious, fast-moving battle with cancer that completely drained our meager savings and broke my heart into a million irreparable pieces. I still vividly remember standing in that quiet, sterile hospital room holding Sarah's fragile, pale hand as she took her final rattling breath. I made her a solemn promise that day. I leaned down, kissed her cold forehead, and swore to her with God as my witness that our little girl would never want for anything in this harsh world. I promised that Chloe would have the absolute best education, the safest home, and a life entirely free from the agonizing financial struggles we had endured together. From that exact moment on, I stopped living for myself. Thomas Gallagher, the man, ceased to exist. I became nothing more than a machine built to provide. I took every single extra shift the garage foreman offered. When other mechanics called in sick or took their warm summer vacations, I was always the first one to raise my hand and take their brutal hours. Holidays, weekends, birthdays, I worked through them all without a single complaint. I told myself that every hour of double time was another sturdy brick in the foundation of Chloe's perfect life. I enrolled Chloe in one of the most prestigious and fiercely expensive private schools in the entire state. The tuition was absolutely staggering. It cost more than I made in my standard 40-hour work week, but I did not care about the cost. I wanted my daughter sitting in bright, warm classrooms, reading classic literature completely shielded from the harsh, dirty realities of the world I lived in. I remember picking her up from that fancy school in my beat-up, rusting work truck. I would always park a full block away, so the other wealthy parents in their luxury vehicles would not see the ugly rust on my fenders or the dark grease stains on my blue uniform. I did not want Chloe to ever feel embarrassed of her blue-collar father. I wanted her to feel like she belonged perfectly with those rich kids. When she needed a new, expensive school uniform, I skipped my own lunches for an entire month, eating nothing but stale bread and tap water in the break room just to afford it. When she begged to go on a lavish school trip to Europe with her wealthy friends, I sold my prized vintage motorcycle, the one single thing I had kept just for my own personal joy, and I handed her the thick envelope of cash with a massive, proud smile on my face. I wore the exact same pair of heavy, steel-toed work boots for 6 long years. When the soles finally cracked open and let the freezing snow in, I patched the holes with heavy industrial glue and thick cardboard just so I could save enough money to buy her a beautiful, expensive white dress for her high school graduation ceremony. I poured every single drop of my life force into that girl. I never once complained. I never once raised my tired voice to tell her how deeply exhausted I was. I wanted her world to be flawless. The human body is simply not meant to endure 4 decades of that kind of severe physical punishment. As the years turned into decades, the terrible toll on my physical health became immense. By the time I hit 50 years old, my knees were completely shot. The protective cartilage was ground down to absolutely nothing from kneeling on freezing hard concrete day in and day out. Every time I stood up, my joints would crack and pop with a sickening sound, shooting white-hot spikes of burning pain straight up my heavy thighs. My lower back was a constant throbbing ache, permanently ruined by lifting heavy truck axles and massive commercial tires without any help. I developed severe, crippling arthritis in my hands. The very same hands that had gently braided Chloe's soft hair when she was a little girl grew thick, twisted, and permanently curled from gripping heavy vibrating tools for 12 hours a night. Some mornings the stiffness was so agonizing that I had to run my hands under scalding hot water in the bathroom sink for 20 solid minutes just to loosen the locked joints enough to hold my steering wheel and drive myself back to the garage. My doctor practically begged me to retire. He looked at my x-rays and told me I was aggressively destroying my own body, warning me that I would end up permanently confined to a wheelchair if I did not stop working immediately. But I looked at the massive tuition bills for Chloe's private university sitting on my kitchen counter, and I simply thanked the doctor for his time, swallowed a handful of cheap over-the-counter painkillers, and drove right back to the freezing garage. I did not view my severe injuries as a tragedy. I viewed them as a profound, beautiful badge of honor. Every thick scar on my knuckles, every painful limp in my step, every sleepless night nursing a torn shoulder muscle was a physical testament to my boundless love for my daughter. I was deeply proud of my broken body. I thought of myself as a heavy iron shield. I was willingly absorbing all the pain, all the dirt, and all the crushing hardship of the world, so that it would never, ever touch Chloe. I believed with every fiber of my being that she understood this silent sacrifice. I believed that when she looked at my thinning gray hair and my stooped, tired shoulders, she saw the immense sacrifices I had made just for her comfort. I thought my unconditional love had permanently purchased her loyalty and her respect. I thought the blood and the dark grease I washed off my skin in the shower every single morning had built an unbreakable sacred bond of gratitude between a father and his only child. I remember one particular Christmas Eve that defined my entire existence. It was the absolute worst blizzard Chicago had seen in over 20 years. The roads were completely blocked with heavy drifting snow, and the temperature had dropped dangerously below zero. A massive commercial shipping company had an entire fleet of trucks break down on the interstate, and the garage manager called me in a total panic. He offered triple pay for anyone crazy enough to come out and get those trucks moving. I had just finished wrapping a beautiful, expensive wooden dollhouse for Chloe. She was exactly 8 years old at the time. I walked quietly into her warm bedroom, kissed her soft cheek as she slept peacefully, and promised her softly that I would be back by morning to watch her open her gifts. I drove my heavy truck through blinding whiteout conditions, nearly sliding off the icy highway 3 separate times. I spent 14 hours straight out in the blistering, deadly cold, lying flat on my back in the deep snow under those massive rigs, replacing blown airlines and frozen brake valves. I could not feel my fingers or my toes at all. My eyelashes were frozen solidly together. The howling wind cut through my heavy coats like invisible razor blades. When I finally finished the brutal job and made it back home, the winter sun was already up. I walked through the front door shivering uncontrollably, my clothes soaked completely through with melting snow and toxic engine fluids. Chloe was sitting happily by the tree playing with her new dollhouse. When she saw me, she ran straight into my freezing arms. I did not care that I was ruining her clean, warm pajamas with my filthy uniform. I held her tight, feeling the wonderful warmth of her little body against my freezing, aching chest. I looked at her happy, smiling face, and I told myself that the agonizing pain in my frozen limbs was completely worth it. I would have gladly laid down in that freezing snow and died for her if it meant she could be safe and happy. That was the kind of devoted father I was. That was the fierce kind of love I gave her. It was not a love of soft words and gentle hugs. It was a heavy, durable love, forged in the fires of back-breaking labor and silent endurance. I gave her absolutely everything I had inside of me until there was practically nothing left of me but worn-out bones and a tired, heavy heart. I built her entire comfortable reality with my own 2 bare hands. And now, standing outside that kitchen window in the freezing rain, all these years later, the ultimate sickening truth washed over me and nearly crushed my soul. The daughter I had willingly sacrificed my body to protect viewed my broken body with nothing but pure disgust and selfish greed. She did not see a loving father who had given up his entire life for hers. She saw a weak, vulnerable target. She saw an old, broken man who was no longer useful as a provider, but whose life savings were ripe for the taking. The very money I had painstakingly saved dollar by painful dollar skipping meals and ignoring doctors was now the grand prize she wanted to steal. The curled arthritic hands she planned to bind with a fraudulent medical diagnosis were the exact same hands that had worked themselves to the bone to pay for the very roof over her head. The absolute devastation of that realization was heavier than any engine block I had ever lifted. It crushed the breath right out of my lungs. But as the initial shock slowly faded into the rainy night, it was replaced by something else. Something dark, cold, and incredibly powerful. I realized that the same endurance, the same stubborn refusal to ever quit that had kept me alive under those crushing trucks for 40 years was still alive deep inside of me. They thought I was just a broken down, senile old fool who would quietly disappear into a padded room. But they forgot one crucial thing. A man who spends his entire life mastering heavy, complicated machinery knows exactly how to tear a machine apart. And the perfect, greedy little machine my daughter and her husband had built to destroy me was about to be dismantled piece by painful piece until there was absolutely nothing left of them at all. When Chloe brought Jamal home for the first time, I genuinely thought my prayers as a single father had finally been answered. I was a man who worked with dirty tools and heavy grease my whole entire life. So when I saw this sharp-dressed, articulate young man walking through my front door, I felt an immense wave of relief wash over my tired soul. Jamal was a real estate agent trying to make a name for himself in the competitive suburbs. He wore tailored suits, drove a spotless car, and had a confident smile that could easily light up a dark room. He looked me right in the eye when he shook my heavy, calloused hand. That is something I always respected in a man. I did not care about his background or how much money he had in his bank account at the time. All I cared about was how he looked at my daughter. He treated Chloe like an absolute queen. He pulled out her chair at the dinner table, opened the car door for her, and spoke about their future together with such incredible passion and certainty. I was completely captivated by the beautiful illusion he projected. I had spent decades worrying about Chloe, terrified that my blue-collar life of scraped knuckles and late-night shifts was not a good enough example for her. Jamal felt like the perfect solution to all my deepest insecurities. He was the successful, polished professional I had always dreamed she would marry. I loved him. I truly loved Jamal like the son I never had. I would proudly tell all the guys down at the mechanic shop about my son-in-law, the successful realtor. I defended him whenever someone said real estate agents were just smooth-talking salesmen. I praised his work ethic. I gave him my complete and unconditional trust. I welcomed him into our family with wide open arms, believing that he was the solid foundation my daughter needed. I thought he was a devoted family man who would protect and cherish Chloe long after I was dead and gone. That blind, foolish trust is exactly what led me to make the biggest financial sacrifice of my retirement years. Shortly after they got married, Chloe came to my small house in tears. She sat at my worn kitchen table and told me they had found their absolute dream home in a beautiful, safe suburban neighborhood with excellent public schools. It was a stunning 4-bedroom house with a big, lush backyard and a beautiful wraparound porch. It was exactly the kind of house I had always wanted to buy for her mother before she passed away. But the housing market was brutal at the time, and Jamal had just started his own independent agency. They were struggling. They simply did not have the cash for the massive down payment the bank was demanding to secure the mortgage. I did not even hesitate for a single second. I did not ask to see their financial statements or question Jamal about his business plan. I drove straight down to my local bank the very next morning. I sat in the branch manager office and signed the heavy paperwork to withdraw a massive chunk of my hard-earned life savings. $150,000 in cold, hard cash. That money represented thousands of hours of freezing night shifts. It represented every vacation I never took, every hot meal I skipped, and every single time I ignored the agonizing pain in my ruined back. But when I handed that certified bank check to Jamal, the look of pure gratitude on his face made every single ache in my broken body completely disappear. He hugged me tight with tears in his eyes and told me he would never, ever forget what I did for them. He called me the rock of their family, and I foolishly believed every single word that came out of his lying, deceitful mouth. I took immense pride in knowing that the beautiful house they slept in, the very same house I had just stood outside of in the freezing rain listening to their evil plot, was secured by the endless sweat of my own brow. I felt like I had finally fulfilled my lifelong duty as a provider. But the absolute greatest reward for all my decades of sacrifice came a few years later. The day my granddaughter Lily was born was without a doubt the single best day of my entire life. When the hospital nurse placed that tiny, fragile little girl into my rough hands, something deep inside my tired, aging soul clicked firmly into place. All the years of profound loneliness after my wife Sarah passed away suddenly vanished into thin air. Lily breathed completely new life into my old bones. From the moment she opened her bright eyes, she became the absolute center of my universe. As she grew from a baby into a little girl, we formed a bond that nobody else could ever possibly understand. She did not care that my hands were heavily scarred and permanently stained with dark diesel oil. She did not care that I walked with a heavy limp or that I wore cheap flannel shirts instead of fancy designer suits like her father. To her, I was not just an old mechanic. She gave me a name that I cherish more than my own life. She called me her Papa Bear. Every Sunday, without fail, she would run out to my heavy truck the moment I pulled into their long driveway. She would throw her little arms around my legs and bury her face in my knees. "Papa Bear is here," she would scream with pure, unadulterated joy. Those precious moments were the only medicine that could ever cure the deep, agonizing pain in my arthritic joints. We had our own special routines that we shared. I would bring her into my dirty, cluttered garage back at my place, and I would set her up on a tall wooden stool near my workbench. I bought her a tiny pair of plastic safety goggles and a little toy wrench. While I was rebuilding a complex carburetor or fixing a busted alternator, she would sit there and pretend to fix her plastic toys right alongside me. She would hand me my tools when I asked, firing off a million curious questions about how big engines worked. She loved to draw. She painted me beautiful, messy pictures of bright yellow sunflowers because she somehow knew they were my absolute favorite flower. I taped every single one of those colorful drawings to the large metal toolbox in my garage. They were my most prized possessions in the entire world. They were far more valuable to me than all the gold or money sitting in my bank accounts. I would read her classic fairy tales until she fell fast asleep against my chest. Her soft breathing, the most peaceful sound I had ever heard in my loud, chaotic life. I would gently stroke her curly hair and silently promise the universe that I would always protect her from the darkness of the world. She was pure innocence. She was the best part of Chloe and the absolute best part of me. Lily was the very reason I woke up every single morning with a smile on my weathered face. She was the only reason I bothered to take my daily blood pressure medication and eat healthy food. I wanted to live long enough to see her graduate high school. I wanted to teach her how to drive a car. I wanted to be there to walk her down the aisle if she ever got married. She was my blood, my beating heart, and my entire world. She was the legacy of love I wanted to leave behind. And that is exactly why the sickening conversation I had just overheard through that cracked kitchen window was so utterly unforgivable. It was a profound violation of the most sacred trust a man can give. Chloe and Jamal were not just plotting to steal the retirement money I had bled for over 40 years. They were planning to take away my only reason for living. They were going to rip Lily away from the only person who truly loved her unconditionally, just so they could selfishly fund a hollow, pathetic lifestyle of expensive wine, luxury vacations, and gambling debts. They wanted to throw my precious little girl into a cheap, isolated boarding school 2 states away, casting her aside like a broken toy they no longer wanted to play with. And they planned to do all of this while they locked me in a drug stupor in the dark ward of Tasha's horrific medical facility. My blind trust and my endless generosity had literally handed them the very weapons they were now using to destroy us both. I had built their perfect suburban life with my own 2 bare hands, and they were using that exact same life as a fortress to execute my absolute demise. They thought my deep love made me blind, weak, and easily manipulated. They thought because I was old and quiet, I would simply fade away without putting up a fight. But they made a catastrophic miscalculation. They did not understand that the ferocious protective love a grandfather has for his little girl is the most dangerous and unstoppable force on the face of the earth. The illusion of my perfect family was completely shattered into a million sharp pieces, and I was going to use every single one of those broken pieces to cut them down. When you spend 40 years repairing heavy diesel engines, you learn a fundamental truth about troubleshooting. You never tear a massive machine apart based on a simple guess. You do not just swing a heavy hammer and hope for the best. You gather your diagnostic tools, you isolate the failing components, and you find the undeniable proof of exactly where the system is broken. That same exact logic applied to the terrifying situation I now found myself in. I had heard my daughter and my son-in-law plotting my absolute demise through a cracked kitchen window in the freezing rain. I knew their end goal was to steal my $2 million and lock me in a psychiatric ward. But hearing a conversation is not enough to dismantle a criminal conspiracy. I needed physical, undeniable proof. I needed to catch the wolves wearing their sheep clothing right on tape. The very next morning, I drove my heavy truck down to a specialized electronics store on the industrial side of Chicago. I walked past the aisles of ordinary televisions and stereos and went straight to the security and surveillance section. I purchased a high-definition wireless micro camera. It was a tiny, incredibly sophisticated piece of technology, no bigger than a coat button equipped with motion sensors, night vision, and a direct wireless connection to a secure cloud server that I could access from my laptop. Then, I drove to a high-end toy store and bought a beautiful, soft brown teddy bear. It broke my heart to use a child toy as a tool for a covert investigation, but I knew Lily would carry that bear everywhere, and I knew my daughter would never suspect a fluffy, stuffed animal sitting in her own living room. I took the camera and the bear back to my greasy garage. I sat at my wooden workbench under the bright fluorescent lights. I used my sharpest razor blade to carefully open a small seam right next to the plastic eye of the teddy bear. My large, calloused hands that were used to wrestling with 1,000-pound truck transmissions, moved with extreme delicacy. I nested the tiny camera deep inside the soft cotton stuffing, ensuring only the microscopic glass lens was visible, perfectly camouflaged in the dark fur next to the eye. I wired the miniature battery pack deep into the belly of the bear and sewed the thick fabric back together using heavy-duty upholstery thread. It was a flawless piece of engineering. The camera was completely invisible. 2 days later, I drove over to Chloe and Jamal's house for my usual Tuesday morning visit. I knocked on the front door holding the brown teddy bear behind my back. When Lily opened the door, her beautiful eyes lit up with pure joy. I handed her the bear and she immediately hugged it tightly against her little chest, thanking her Papa Bear over and over again. I walked into the house playing the part of the tired, oblivious old grandfather perfectly. Chloe was in the kitchen wearing her expensive silk robe making breakfast. I told Lily that her new bear needed a good vantage point to watch over the house while she was at school. I gently took the stuffed animal from her hands and placed it high up on the decorative wooden mantel in the living room. I positioned it so the hidden camera had a wide, unobstructed, high-definition view of the entire living room, and most importantly, the large marble kitchen island where Chloe prepared my drinks and meals. Chloe walked over and kissed my rough cheek. She asked me how I was feeling today with a smile so sweet and genuine, it made my stomach completely turn over. Over the past 2 months, my health had been failing in strange, unexplainable ways. I had been feeling constantly exhausted. A heavy, thick brain fog seemed to follow me everywhere I went. I was forgetting simple things like the route to the local grocery store or where I had placed my truck keys just 5 minutes prior. Worse than the memory loss was the physical clumsiness. My hands, which had always been as steady as a rock, had started trembling uncontrollably. I had recently dropped one of my favorite heavy socket wrenches in the garage, nearly crushing my own foot because my fingers simply lost their grip. I was terrified. I truly believed that my old age had finally caught up with me and that my mind was slowly rotting away. I had spent countless nights sitting alone in my dark living room crying silent tears because I thought I was naturally developing Alzheimer's disease. I thought I was losing my independence. Chloe handed me my favorite ceramic mug filled with dark roast coffee. I thanked her, my hands shaking slightly as I took the hot cup. She put her hand over mine and told me to be careful, pretending to look at me with deep, loving concern. She told me she was worried about my memory and my motor skills, planting the psychological seeds of my own incompetence right to my face. I drank the coffee. It tasted a little more bitter than usual, but I forced it down completely unaware of the deadly poison sliding down my throat. I spent an hour playing with Lily before walking her out to the school bus. Then I hugged my deceitful daughter goodbye and drove straight back to my house. I walked into my quiet home, locked the heavy front door, and immediately opened my old laptop on the kitchen table. My heart was pounding fiercely against my ribs as I logged into the secure cloud server. The live feed from the teddy bear popped up on my screen. The picture was incredibly crisp and clear. I could see the entire living room and the kitchen island perfectly. I rewound the digital timeline back to the exact moment I had arrived at their house earlier that morning. I watched myself walk through the front door. I watched myself place the teddy bear on the wooden mantle. I watched myself leave the kitchen to go help Lily find her pink backpack in the hallway. Then the camera feed showed Chloe standing completely alone in the kitchen. I leaned closer to the glowing laptop screen. The garage was dead silent around me. The only sound was the heavy, labored breathing coming from my own lungs. On the screen, I watched my daughter glance nervously toward the hallway to make sure I was completely out of sight. When she was satisfied that she was alone, she reached deep into the pocket of her silk robe. She pulled out a small orange prescription pill bottle. She opened the white plastic cap. She tapped 3 small pills out onto the marble countertop. She grabbed the back of a heavy metal spoon and pressed down hard, violently crushing the pills into a fine white powder. I zoomed the video feed in my hands, trembling over the keyboard. I recognized the shape and color of the pills before they were completely pulverized. And even if I had not, the horrible reality was undeniable. I had spent hours doing research the night before trying to understand how they planned to make me look crazy. Now I had my horrifying answer. Chloe was not waiting for my mind to naturally deteriorate. She was actively and deliberately destroying my brain chemistry. She was crushing low-dose benzodiazepines, heavy, powerful sedatives typically used to treat severe panic attacks or to tranquilize aggressive psychiatric patients. She was dosing a 68-year-old man with dangerous narcotics that were completely unprescribed and highly toxic in the wrong quantities. These specific sedatives were notorious for causing severe confusion, extreme lethargy, memory loss, and a loss of physical coordination in elderly people. They were the exact symptoms of rapid onset dementia. I watched the screen in absolute paralyzing horror as my own flesh and blood took a small kitchen knife and scraped the crushed white powder off the marble counter. She swept the toxic dust directly into my favorite ceramic coffee mug. She poured the steaming hot dark roast coffee over the powder, watching it dissolve instantly into the black liquid. She took a silver spoon and stirred it slowly, methodically, with absolutely no hesitation or remorse on her face. She wiped the counter clean with a damp rag, put the orange pill bottle back into her pocket, and completely composed herself. Just seconds later on the video feed, I watched myself walk back into the kitchen, smiling warmly at the woman who was systematically poisoning me to death. I watched her hand me the poisoned cup with that fake, loving smile. The profound level of betrayal was something I cannot even begin to accurately describe with human words. It bypassed simple anger and went straight into a realm of pure psychological agony. The brain fog, the terrifying memory lapses, the shaking hands that had caused me so many sleepless nights of sheer terror. None of it was natural. My body was not failing me. My mind was not rotting away. I was not losing my independence to a tragic medical condition. I was being chemically assaulted by the little girl I had carried on my shoulders. I was being heavily drugged by the daughter I had worked 40 years in the freezing snow to protect. She was manufacturing my incompetence drop by toxic drop, laying the perfect medical foundation for her sister-in-law Tasha to officially declare me insane. I sat back in my wooden chair. The laptop screen continued to play the silent video of the empty kitchen. A single hot tear rolled down my weathered, deeply lined cheek. It was the very last tear I would ever shed for Chloe Gallagher. The deep, agonizing sorrow of a broken father instantly evaporated, replaced entirely by the cold, calculated and terrifying fury of a man who has just survived an assassination attempt. They had crossed a line that could never ever be uncrossed. My daughter had chosen money over her father life. She had chosen greed over her own blood. She had weaponized my morning coffee to turn me into a compliant, drooling ghost. I reached out and gently closed the laptop. The undeniable physical proof was now safely secured in the cloud. I had the smoking gun. The diagnostic phase of my investigation was officially complete. I knew exactly which parts of the machine were rotten, and I knew exactly how they were operating. I stood up from my kitchen table. My back ached and my ruined knees popped loudly in the quiet room, but my mind had never felt more sharp, clear, and incredibly dangerous. I walked over to the kitchen sink and poured the remaining contents of my thermos, the coffee I had only pretended to swallow earlier, straight down the drain. The old, senile fool they thought they were dealing with was officially dead. The protective grandfather, the hardened, heavy-duty mechanic who knew exactly how to dismantle a broken system, was now fully awake. It was time to stop gathering evidence and start building the trap that would send every single one of them straight to a concrete prison cell. I had the video evidence of my own daughter poisoning my morning coffee, but that was only one single piece of this sickening puzzle. Chloe was the inside man, the one with direct access to my food and my home. But Jamal and his sister Tasha were the true architects of the financial and legal trap. I knew exactly how to rebuild a cracked engine block from the ground up, but I did not know the first thing about tracking hidden bank accounts or digging up classified medical records. For that specific job, I needed a hardened professional. I needed a bloodhound who knew exactly how to navigate the dirty hidden alleys of the city and pull the rotting skeletons out of the closet. An old friend from the mechanic garage put me in touch with a man named Mike Sullivan. Mike was a gritty, retired Chicago police detective who had spent 30 brutal years working organized crime and financial fraud before opening his own private investigation firm. I met Mike late on a Wednesday night at a rundown diner on the south side of town. The place smelled heavily of stale coffee and old frying oil, a harsh smell that made me feel right at home. Mike was a big, heavy-set man with a thick gray mustache and cold eyes that looked like they had seen every terrible thing a human being could possibly do to another. I sat down in the squeaky vinyl booth and slid a thick manila envelope right across the sticky table. Inside that envelope was $10,000 in cash, my entire emergency rainy day fund, along with the full names and home addresses of Jamal Richards and his sister Tasha. I looked Mike dead in the eye and told him I needed to know absolutely everything about these two people. I needed to know what they did in the dark when nobody else was looking. Mike slowly counted the cash with his thick thumbs, nodded his heavy head, and told me to give him exactly 48 hours. Those 2 days of waiting were the longest and most agonizing hours of my entire life. I had to keep going over to Chloe and Jamal's house. I had to keep pretending that the toxic poison my daughter was feeding me was actually working. I purposely dropped a heavy ceramic plate of food on their kitchen floor and wept fake, pathetic tears of frustration, apologizing over and over for my failing hands. I watched Jamal look at Chloe with a greedy, triumphant smirk while I cleaned up the mess on my knees. I wanted to reach right across the kitchen table and crush his throat with my bare hands, but I forced myself to swallow my burning rage. I played the pathetic, broken old man, perfectly waiting patiently for the heavy hammer I was building to finally be ready to swing. On Friday evening, my cell phone rang loudly in the quiet garage. It was Mike. He told me to come down to his office immediately. His office was a small, cramped, poorly lit room above a loud bowling alley completely filled with towering stacks of paper and the thick smell of cheap cigars. When I walked through the door, Mike did not even say hello to me. He just pointed a thick finger to a wooden chair across from his cluttered metal desk. His face was deadly grim. He opened a thick black folder and spread dozens of photographs and highlighted financial documents across the desk. "You were right to follow your gut," Tommy Mike said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the sound of the bowling pins crashing downstairs. "Your smooth-talking son-in-law is not a successful real estate agent. He is a walking dead man." Mike slid a thick stack of bank statements toward me. He explained that Jamal had not sold a single house in over 14 months. His independent real estate agency was nothing but a hollow fake shell, a pathetic front to make him look like a respectable, wealthy businessman to the outside world. The expensive tailored suits, the luxury leased car sitting in his driveway, the fancy country club dinners. They were all completely funded by massive amounts of high-interest credit card debt. But the credit cards were not the worst of it. The worst part was the surveillance photographs Mike showed me next. The grainy pictures showed Jamal standing in dark, empty parking lots late at night, looking absolutely terrified, talking to large, highly dangerous-looking men. Mike explained that Jamal had a severe, uncontrollable gambling addiction. He had been placing massive, reckless bets on underground sports games through an illegal, highly violent syndicate deeply connected to organized crime. He had lost over and over again, chasing his losses until he was buried alive. Jamal currently owed $500,000 to men who did not send polite collection letters in the mail. They sent men with steel baseball bats. They had already threatened to break his legs, harm his family, and burn his beautiful suburban house straight to the ground. Jamal was completely cornered like a frightened rat. He was drowning in a dark, violent ocean of illegal debt, and my $2 million in retirement savings was the only life raft he could possibly see. The sickening reality washed over me like a bucket of freezing water. The beautiful, perfect suburban life I thought my daughter was living was a complete and total fabrication. I had happily handed over $150,000 of my hard-earned savings for the down payment on their house, and Jamal had gambled away their entire future in dark back rooms. But the evil conspiracy went much deeper than Jamal and his pathetic gambling problem. I looked at Mike and asked him what he had found out about Tasha, the woman who was supposed to be running a highly respectable medical facility. Mike took a deep breath and rubbed his tired eyes. Tasha is even worse than her brother Tommy, he said quietly. Tasha is a monster. He pulled out a separate massive stack of documents with federal government seals printed on the top corners. Tasha Richards is the director of a private assisted living facility, but the place is practically a slaughterhouse for the elderly. Mike revealed that Tasha was currently the primary target of a massive covert federal investigation by the Office of Inspector General and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For the past 3 long years, Tasha had been orchestrating a multi-million-dollar Medicare fraud ring. She was systematically billing the federal government for incredibly expensive medical treatments, specialized therapies, and high-end medications that her vulnerable elderly patients never actually received. She was inventing phantom illnesses, forging the signatures of licensed doctors, and pocketing millions of dollars in stolen taxpayer money. But the massive financial theft was not even the most evil part of her daily operation. In order to keep her overhead costs incredibly low and maximize her illegal profits, Tasha was severely understaffing her facility. To keep the elderly patients quiet and compliant so the tiny skeleton crew of nurses could manage them, Tasha had her corrupt doctors prescribe massive, completely unnecessary doses of heavy chemical sedatives. It was systematic, calculated, and deeply cruel elder abuse. She was turning innocent people, beloved mothers and grandfathers, into mindless zombies. She was locking them in dark, quiet rooms so they would not wander the halls or demand basic human care. Dozens of heartbroken families had recently filed anonymous complaints, and the federal authorities were finally closing in on her entire operation. Tasha knew the walls were crumbling. Her illegal assets were on the verge of being completely frozen by the federal government. She was looking at 20 solid years in a federal penitentiary if she could not immediately hire a team of elite, high-priced defense attorneys to drag the court case out or completely flee the country altogether. I sat frozen in that cramped, smoky office, staring down at the horrible evidence spread out before me. The jagged pieces of the puzzle slammed violently into place. This horrific plot was never just about greedy kids wanting to take luxury vacations to Europe. This was about absolute desperate survival for a family of ruthless, cornered criminals. Jamal owed $500,000 to violent thugs who were going to kill him in the street. Tasha needed massive amounts of untraceable cash to fight off the federal government and stay out of a concrete prison cell. They were 2 desperate people at the very end of their ropes, and they had successfully convinced my greedy, soulless daughter to help them slaughter her own father just to save themselves. Tasha already had the hidden network of corrupt doctors ready to falsely diagnose me with severe dementia. She already had the locked, padded room waiting for me in her house of horrors. They were going to use the exact same chemical straitjacket on me that they used on their other tragic victims. Chloe had already started the process by putting those crushed pills in my morning coffee. They were going to steal my entire life savings, pay off the violent sports bookies, hire the expensive criminal lawyers, and leave me rotting in a dark room until my heart finally gave out. And the absolute most terrifying part of all was that if they actually succeeded, my innocent little granddaughter, Lily, would be left completely alone in the hands of these desperate monsters. Mike looked at me across the cluttered desk, his hard eyes filled with a mixture of deep pity and profound respect. He told me that I needed to take all of this evidence to the local police immediately. He said we had more than enough proof to get a protective restraining order and get me to a safe, secure location away from them. But I slowly shook my head. I looked down at my thick, scarred mechanic hands. A simple piece of paper like a restraining order would not fix this massive problem. A standard police report would not guarantee that my precious Lily would be safe from their influence forever. If I just ran away and hid, they would find another creative way to get exactly what they wanted. They would sell the house pack Lily into a car and disappear into the wind where I could never protect her again. I looked Mike straight in his cold eyes and told him we were not going to the local police just yet. I told him I did not just want to survive this attack. I wanted to completely eradicate the threat from the face of the earth. I wanted to build a trap so tight, so legally devastating, and so incredibly permanent that neither Jamal nor Tasha nor my treacherous daughter would ever see the light of day again. I asked Mike if he knew a lawyer who had the sharp teeth of a bulldog and the absolute lack of mercy required to take down a criminal syndicate like this. Mike smiled a very slow, very dangerous smile. He reached into his wooden desk drawer and pulled out a plain white business card. The tired old mechanic was gone. The old wolf inside of me was fully awake, and I was finally ready to hunt them down. I thought the sickening revelations in that cramped, smoky office had finally reached their absolute limit. I thought knowing about the massive gambling debts and the horrific Medicare fraud was the absolute bottom of this dark abyss. But Mike Sullivan, the gritty retired detective sitting across the cluttered metal desk from me, was not quite finished. The heavy air in the room felt suffocating as Mike slowly reached into his desk drawer one last time. He did not say a single word at first. He just pulled out a thin, plain manila folder and slid it very carefully across the scratched wooden surface toward my heavy, calloused hands. His cold eyes locked onto mine, and the look of deep sorrow on his face told me that this final piece of evidence was going to be the most devastating blow of all. I took a slow, rattling breath and opened the thin folder. Inside was a stack of legal documents printed on thick, expensive paper. The bold black letters at the very top of the first page read, "Durable Power of Attorney and Healthcare Proxy." I stared at those heavy legal words for a long time, my tired mind struggling to process what I was actually looking at. Mike leaned forward, resting his thick elbows on the desk, and explained exactly how he had obtained these terrifying papers. He told me that Jamal was incredibly reckless. My arrogant son-in-law had been using his personal laptop on an unsecured wireless network to communicate with a deeply corrupt attorney downtown. This sleazy lawyer specialized in exploiting legal loopholes to help greedy families hijack the estates of wealthy, vulnerable seniors. Mike had used his old contacts in the cybercrimes division to intercept their hidden emails. I looked down at the bottom of the legal document. There, sitting right on the black ink line, was my own signature, Thomas Gallagher. The letters were perfectly formed. The slight slant of the letter T and the heavy loop of the letter G were incredibly accurate. But I had never held a pen to that paper. It was a complete and total forgery. I stared at my stolen name, and a wave of pure physical nausea washed over my entire body. I thought about all the times I had used my signature to build a life for my daughter. I had signed her elementary school report cards with absolute pride. I had signed the heavy bank loans to pay for her expensive private college tuition. I had signed the massive cashier check for the down payment on the very house where she was currently plotting my absolute ruin. My signature was my solemn bond as a father and a hardworking man. Now my own flesh and blood had traced my name to sign my literal death warrant. Mike explained the horrifying power of the document sitting in front of me. This forged paper was the master key to my entire existence. Once this document was officially notarized and filed with the local court, I would completely cease to exist as an independent human being. Chloe would be granted absolute unchecked legal control over every single aspect of my life. She would have total access to my $2 million retirement fund. She would have the legal authority to immediately sell the small, quiet house I had lived in for 40 years. But the financial theft was nothing compared to the dark power of the healthcare proxy. That specific piece of paper gave my daughter the absolute legal right to dictate my medical care. She could refuse medical treatments, force me into a locked institution, and authorize the use of heavy chemical restraints without anyone ever questioning her motives. She would become my god, and I would become her silent, helpless prisoner. I asked Mike when they were planning to execute this horrific trap. Mike pulled a printed email exchange from the back of the folder and pointed a thick finger at a specific date. "Next Friday," he said quietly. "They have it all scheduled for next Friday morning." The timeline hit me like a physical punch to the chest. Earlier that very week, Chloe had called me on the phone, her voice dripping with fake, sugary sweetness. She had told me she wanted to take her old dad out for a nice breakfast on Friday morning to spend some quality time together. She said they needed to run a quick errand right after we ate, but she promised it would not take long. I had smiled when she called, foolishly thinking my daughter just wanted to share a cup of coffee with her aging father. Now, the absolute terrifying truth of that quick errand was laid bare in front of me. Next Friday was the day of my planned execution. Mike explained the precise details of their sickening schedule. Chloe and Jamal were going to drive me to a private medical clinic on the outskirts of the city. The clinic was run by a deeply corrupt neurologist who was completely on Tasha payroll. This specialist was the exact same doctor who helped Tasha fabricate the phantom illnesses for her massive Medicare fraud operation. The doctor was already fully briefed on the plan. I would walk into that examination room heavily drugged and completely disoriented from the crushed sedatives Chloe had been secretly feeding me all week. The corrupt doctor would perform a fake medical evaluation. He would look at my trembling hands, listen to my drug-induced confusion, and officially diagnose me with severe late-stage Alzheimer's disease. He would stamp his official medical seal on a sworn legal affidavit declaring Thomas Gallagher entirely incompetent and a severe danger to himself. But the nightmare did not end at the doctor office. Mike flipped to the final intercepted email. It was a direct message from Tasha to Jamal. The message confirmed that a bed was already prepared and waiting for me in the lockdown ward of Tasha Private Assisted Living Facility. They were not even going to let me go back to my own house to pack a bag or say goodbye to my life. The moment the corrupt doctor signed that affidavit, Jamal and Chloe were going to load me directly back into their luxury car and drive me straight to Tasha House of Horrors. I closed my eyes, and a terrifying, vivid vision of next Friday afternoon played out in my mind. I saw the heavy metal doors of the lockdown ward slamming shut behind me. I saw the cold, uncaring nurses, the ones Tasha paid to look the other way, grabbing my tired arms and forcing me into a small, dark room. I felt the sharp prick of a heavy hypodermic needle sliding into my skin, pumping massive, unprescribed doses of chemical tranquilizers directly into my bloodstream. I saw myself trapped in a padded chair, drooling, completely unable to speak or fight back, staring blankly at a white cinder block wall, while my own brain slowly suffocated under the weight of the heavy sedatives. I would be buried alive inside my own mind. I would spend the final years of my life locked in a silent chemical hell, completely forgotten by the outside world, while my daughter and her husband traveled the world, spending the money I had broken my back to earn. And then, the most agonizing thought of all pierced straight through my heart. Lily. If I disappeared into that locked ward next Friday, I would never see my beautiful granddaughter ever again. She would be completely at the mercy of these cold-blooded monsters. When Sunday rolled around and I did not show up in my heavy truck to read her a fairy tale, they would lie to her. They would tell her that her Papa Bear had lost his mind and forgotten all about her. They would break her precious little heart to justify their own evil. And then, just like Jamal had promised, they would pack her tiny bags and ship her off to that miserable cheap boarding school in Missouri. She would be abandoned, crying for a grandfather who was trapped away in a dark room, completely unable to answer her calls. I opened my eyes and looked down at my rough, scarred hands. They were trembling, but this time it was not from the toxic poison my daughter had been feeding me. It was from a pure, unadulterated volcanic rage. The kind of rage that burns away every single ounce of fear and leaves nothing behind but cold, hardened steel. They had laid out their entire master plan. They had forged the documents, bribed the doctor, and prepared the locked room. They thought they were holding all the heavy cards. They thought next Friday was going to be the easiest payday of their pathetic, greedy lives. I slowly closed the manila folder. I slid it back across the desk to Mike. He watched me carefully, waiting for me to break down, waiting for the old mechanic to finally shatter under the crushing weight of this horrific betrayal. But I did not shed a single tear. The time for weeping was completely over. "Keep these files safe, Mike," I said, my voice sounding completely unrecognizable to my own ears. It was a deep, dangerous, gravelly sound. Mike nodded slowly. "What is the play, Tommy?" he asked. "We have exactly 1 week before they put that pen in your hand and march you into that slaughterhouse. Do you want me to call the feds right now?" I stood up from the squeaky vinyl chair. My bad knees popped loudly, but I did not feel the pain anymore. I felt an incredible surge of absolute clarity. "No," I told him. "We do not call them yet. If we spook them now, they will just shred the forged documents and run. I want them to feel completely safe. I want them to think their brilliant little trap worked perfectly. Let them set up the appointment. Let them bring the forged papers. Let them think they have completely won." I looked around the smoky, cramped office, feeling the heavy spirit of justice settling deep into my old bones. "They have given us a firm deadline," I continued. "Next Friday. That gives me exactly 7 days to completely liquidate my entire life. 7 days to secure my granddaughter's future. 7 days to build a legal bomb so massive and so undeniable that when it finally detonates in that fancy law office, it will completely vaporize their entire existence." I reached out and shook Mike's heavy hand. The old wolf was fully prepared for war. They wanted to use the law to turn me into a ghost. But they were about to learn a very brutal lesson. When you back a hardened mechanic into a corner and threaten the only child he truly loves, you do not just get a fight. You get absolute, total, and permanent destruction. I turned and walked out of the dark office, stepping out into the cold Chicago night. The countdown to next Friday had officially begun. I never thought of myself as an actor. I am a man who spent 40 years turning heavy steel wrenches and rebuilding massive diesel engines. My hands are thick with calluses and permanently stained with dark grease. I know how to fix broken things. I do not know how to put on a mask and pretend to be someone else. But when you realize that your own flesh and blood is actively trying to destroy you, and when the safety of your precious granddaughter is hanging by a single fragile thread, you discover that a desperate father is capable of absolutely anything. I had exactly 7 days until that scheduled doctor appointment. 7 days to convince my treacherous daughter and her greedy husband that their toxic poison was completely destroying my brain. I had to put on the greatest performance of my entire life, and I had to do it while looking directly into the eyes of the monsters who wanted me dead. The very next morning, I began my brutal campaign of deception. I woke up before the sun, staring at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. I needed to look like a man who was rapidly fading away. I intentionally chose clothes that were 2 sizes too big. A faded plaid shirt and loose denim jeans that hung off my frame, making my broad shoulders look shrunken and frail. I left my silver hair uncombed and allowed a rough gray stubble to grow out on my jawline. I practiced stooping my back, letting my chest cave inward to mimic the heavy, defeated posture of a man losing his battle with time. When I finally walked out to my heavy truck, I did not walk with the heavy, purposeful strides of a mechanic. I shuffled my heavy work boots against the concrete, letting my knees buckle just a little bit with every single step. When I arrived at Chloe and Jamal's house for our usual morning visit, the air inside felt incredibly thick and suffocating. I walked through the front door leaning heavily against the wooden doorframe, as if the simple act of walking up the driveway had completely exhausted my lungs. Chloe was standing in the bright kitchen wearing a pristine white sweater, humming a cheerful tune as she prepared the morning breakfast. It took every single ounce of willpower I possessed not to march across that clean marble floor and wrap my thick hands around her throat. Instead, I forced my hands to tremble violently. I let my jaw go slack and allowed a confused, vacant expression to completely take over my face. She turned around and saw me standing there. Her eyes immediately darted to my shaking hands and my stooped posture. A flash of pure, wicked satisfaction crossed her face before she quickly buried it beneath a mask of fake, sugary concern. "Dad," she said, rushing over to take my arm. "You look so incredibly tired today. Are you feeling all right?" I looked at her, forcing my eyes to appear cloudy and unfocused. "I do not know, sweetheart," I mumbled, my voice weak and raspy. "I just feel so lost today. My head is full of heavy fog. I cannot seem to think straight." She guided me to the heavy wooden chair at the kitchen island, patting my shoulder with a gentle touch that made my skin completely crawl. "Sit down and rest," she told me. "I will make you your favorite dark roast coffee. It will wake you right up." I watched her walk over to the coffee maker. I knew exactly what was inside the deep pockets of that white sweater. I knew she was reaching for the small orange pill bottle filled with the crushed sedatives. I sat there and watched my own daughter covertly sprinkle the heavy narcotics into my ceramic mug, stirring the toxic powder into the black liquid with a silver spoon. When she placed the steaming mug in front of me, the true test of my acting abilities began. I reached out with both hands, letting them shake so violently that the hot, dark coffee sloshed over the rim of the mug and burned my thick knuckles. I did not pull away from the pain. I let the burning liquid stain my skin, using the physical pain to ground me in the horrific reality of the moment. I brought the ceramic rim to my lips and pretended to take a long, deep swallow. But I did not let a single drop of that poisoned liquid touch my tongue. I had come prepared. Tucked inside the deep inner pocket of my oversized canvas jacket was a heavy steel thermos with a wide mouth. As I lowered the mug, I intentionally fumbled with the handle. "Oh no," I gasped, pretending to lose my grip. The heavy ceramic mug tipped forward, spilling a large splash of coffee onto the marble counter. Chloe immediately turned around, letting out a sharp sigh of deep annoyance. While her back was turned to grab a paper towel, my heavy mechanic hands moved with lightning speed and precise accuracy. I poured the majority of the poisoned coffee directly into the open thermos hidden inside my coat, leaving just a small fraction of the liquid at the very bottom of the mug. By the time Chloe turned back around to wipe up the spilled mess, it looked exactly as if I had greedily consumed the entire toxic dose. "You need to be more careful, Dad," she scolded me, though I could clearly hear the underlying thrill in her voice. Her poison was supposedly working. I simply nodded, letting my head loll forward as if the heavy sedatives were already taking their toll on my nervous system. "I am sorry, Chloe," I whispered pathetically. "My hands just will not listen to me anymore." But faking the physical symptoms of the poison was only the beginning of my agonizing performance. To secure the medical diagnosis of severe Alzheimer's disease next Friday, I needed to show a complete collapse of my cognitive abilities and motor functions. That evening, Jamal came home from his fake real estate office. He walked into the kitchen looking incredibly stressed. No doubt fielding threatening phone calls from the violent sports bookies he owed $500,000 to. We all sat down at the large dining room table for dinner. Chloe had prepared a heavy roast chicken. She handed me a large ceramic plate filled with hot food. I knew exactly what I had to do. As I took the plate from her hands, I locked my eyes directly onto Jamal. I wanted to see his exact reaction. I completely released my grip on the right side of the plate. The heavy ceramic dish crashed violently onto the hardwood floor. The loud, shattering sound echoed sharply through the quiet house. Hot gravy, mashed potatoes, and pieces of roasted meat completely covered the expensive rug and splattered onto Jamal's polished leather shoes. Jamal jumped up from his chair, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he shouted, completely dropping his smooth, friendly facade. "You are ruining everything in this house." Chloe quickly stood up and grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Jamal, stop it," she said in a loud whisper. "Can you not see he is completely losing his mind? Look at him." I slumped forward in my wooden chair, letting my shoulders heave as I began to weep. I forced thick, pathetic tears to roll down my weathered cheeks. "I am sorry," I sobbed loudly, my voice cracking with fake devastation. "I did not mean to do it. I just cannot hold anything anymore. I am so sorry." I slowly lowered myself down out of the chair, dropping onto my ruined, arthritic knees, directly into the hot, messy pile of food. I began to scoop the mashed potatoes and broken ceramic shards up with my bare, shaking hands, completely humiliating myself in front of the two people who wanted me dead. As I knelt there on the floor, wiping the hot gravy up with my bare palms, I secretly glanced up through my wet eyelashes. I saw Chloe looking down at me. She was not looking at a father who had worked 40 years in the freezing snow to buy her that very dining room table. She was looking at a pathetic, broken animal. And then, the most terrifying thing of all happened. The corner of her mouth slowly curled upward. She smirked. It was a cold, calculated, and deeply evil smirk. She was thoroughly enjoying my complete degradation. She felt incredibly powerful, believing her toxic chemical cocktail had finally broken the strong old mechanic down into a crying, helpless fool on her floor. That sickening smirk burned itself permanently into my memory. It completely eradicated any lingering ounce of mercy I might have had left in my heavy heart. But the absolute hardest part of my performance, the part that nearly broke my spirit and forced me to abandon the entire plan, happened the very next afternoon. It involved the only innocent soul in that cursed house, my beautiful 7-year-old granddaughter, Lily. I was sitting on the comfortable living room couch, staring blankly at the dark television screen, maintaining my facade of severe dementia. Lily came running through the front door, having just been dropped off by the yellow school bus. She was wearing her bright pink backpack and holding a piece of heavy construction paper. Her face was lit up with pure radiant joy. "Papa Bear," she screamed, running across the living room carpet directly toward me. "I painted a new picture for your dirty garage." She threw her small, warm arms around my heavy neck, burying her face into my chest. The familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo filled my nose, and my heart physically ached with an overwhelming surge of pure love. Every single instinct inside my body screamed at me to wrap my strong arms around her, to kiss her soft forehead, and to tell her how much I loved her beautiful painting. But I could feel Chloe standing in the kitchen doorway, watching my every single move like a hungry hawk. I knew that if I showed even a single moment of absolute clarity, the entire illusion would be completely shattered. Jamal would cancel the doctor appointment, they would destroy the forged documents, and they would immediately kidnap Lily and disappear. I had to break my granddaughter's heart to save her life. I did not hug her back. I let my arms hang limply at my sides. I slowly pushed her small, warm body away from my chest. I looked down into her bright, excited eyes, and I completely deadened my own. I forced my face to become a blank, empty slate. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice completely flat and devoid of any human emotion. Lily froze. Her beautiful smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of profound, terrifying confusion. She looked at my face, searching desperately for her Papa Bear, but I refused to let him surface. "It is me, Papa Bear," she whispered, her small lower lip beginning to tremble uncontrollably. "It is Lily. Your Lily." I slowly shook my head, letting my eyes drift aimlessly past her shoulder, staring blankly at the wall. "I do not know any Lily," I said loudly, making sure my voice carried directly into the kitchen. "Where is my wife? Where is Sarah? I want to go back to the garage. Who is this little girl?" The absolute devastation that washed over my granddaughter's face was the most agonizing thing I have ever witnessed in my entire 68 years on this earth. It was a million times worse than a crushed hand or a broken back. Heavy, thick tears immediately welled up in her innocent eyes. She dropped the beautiful painted picture onto the floor. It was a bright yellow sunflower. She took a step back from me, her tiny chest heaving with deep, painful sobs. "Papa Bear does not know me," she cried out, turning and running out of the living room, her small footsteps echoing loudly up the wooden stairs. I sat there on that couch, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the pain I had just inflicted on the only person I truly loved. It felt as though someone had reached directly into my chest and crushed my beating heart with a heavy steel vice. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the house down to its very foundation. I wanted to run up those stairs, hold her tight, and promise her I was just playing a terrible game. But I remained perfectly still. I continued to stare blankly at the dark television screen. Chloe walked slowly into the living room. She looked at the abandoned sunflower painting on the floor, and then she looked at me. There was no sympathy for her crying daughter. There was only the cold, hard satisfaction of a successful predator. "See, Jamal," Chloe called out toward the hallway, her voice filled with dark triumph. "The medicine is working perfectly. He is completely gone. His mind is absolute mush. We are definitely ready for the doctor on Friday." I sat there playing the mindless fool, while a terrifying absolute silence settled deep into my soul. They had stolen my money. They had poisoned my coffee. They had forged my signature to steal my legal freedom. And now they had forced me to shatter the heart of my precious little angel. The agonizing emotional pain of playing this pathetic role was indescribable, but it served its purpose flawlessly. They had completely lowered their guard. They believed they had decisively won the war without me ever fighting back. They were so blinded by their own selfish greed and their arrogant cruelty that they failed to see the terrible truth hidden right behind my vacant eyes. I was not losing my mind. I was sharpening it into a deadly weapon. The old wolf was simply playing dead patiently, waiting for the perfect moment to lock his heavy jaws permanently around their throats. The days that followed were a waking nightmare of dual existence. During the daylight hours, I was a broken old man crumbling under the heavy weight of an artificial illness. I drooled my poisoned coffee onto my shirt. I stumbled over my own feet in my daughter's kitchen. I let my own flesh and blood look at me with that sickening smirk of absolute triumph. But when the sun went down and the suburban house finally grew quiet, I shed that pathetic skin. I would wait in the dark of my quiet living room until I was absolutely certain Chloe and Jamal were fast asleep in their stolen house. Then I would quietly slip out the back door of my own home, ease my heavy truck into neutral, and let it roll silently down the long driveway before starting the loud diesel engine. I was not a weak victim anymore. I was a hardened soldier preparing for the final brutal battle. Mike Sullivan, the gritty retired detective I had hired, had set up a midnight meeting at a massive high-rise office building in downtown Chicago. When the polished silver elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, I stepped out into a world I had never, ever belonged to. The floors were shining marble that reflected the expensive modern art hanging on the walls. I looked down at my worn canvas jacket, my faded flannel shirt, and my dark grease-stained work boots. I felt completely out of place among the rich and powerful. But I stood tall. I walked with heavy, purposeful steps into the massive, glass-walled conference room where Mike was already waiting. Sitting directly at the head of a long, polished mahogany table was a woman who would become the master architect of my vengeance. Her name was Evelyn Hayes. She was a high-powered attorney who specialized exclusively in federal elder law and aggressive asset protection. Evelyn was a terrifying force of nature. She wore a sharp, dark charcoal suit and had piercing brown eyes that missed absolutely nothing in the room. She did not look at me with the fake pity I was so incredibly used to seeing from doctors and social workers. She looked at me with the cold, hard respect of a fellow warrior preparing for war. She pointed to a heavy leather chair and I sat down. My ruined knees popped loudly in the quiet room, but she did not even blink. Mike slid my battered old laptop across the expensive mahogany wood. He opened the digital file containing the hidden camera footage from the soft brown teddy bear I had given my beautiful granddaughter Lily. Evelyn sat perfectly still as she watched the high-definition video play out on the glowing screen. She watched my own daughter calmly crush heavy chemical sedatives into a fine powder and mix them directly into my morning coffee. I watched Evelyn face very closely. Her sharp jaw clenched so tight the muscles rippled. Her piercing brown eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. She was a woman who made a very lucrative living fighting against the terrible exploitation of the elderly, but even she seemed deeply disturbed by the sheer cold-blooded nature of Chloe Betrayal. "A stranger stealing your money is a terrible crime," Evelyn said softly, her voice echoing in the large, quiet room. "But a daughter deliberately poisoning the hard-working father who raised her is an absolute abomination." But the horrifying video of the chemical poisoning was just the opening act of our midnight presentation. Mike started pulling the thick financial documents and the grainy surveillance photographs out of his heavy manila folders. He laid out the undeniable hard proof of Jamal's massive illegal gambling debts to the violent underground sports bookies. He showed Evelyn the fake real estate records, the maxed-out credit cards, and the desperate late-night meetings in empty parking lots with dangerous thugs. Then Mike dropped the heaviest bomb of all. He spread out the massive stack of documents detailing the horrific Medicare fraud ring run by Jamal's older sister Tasha. He explained exactly how Tasha was running her private assisted living facility. He described how it functioned as a dark chemical prison for vulnerable seniors, heavily medicating them to keep staffing costs low while she billed the federal government for millions of dollars in fake treatments. Finally, Mike placed the forged power of attorney and the fake medical proxy right in the center of the table. He explained that they planned to use these fake documents to lock me away in that exact same horrific facility next Friday. Evelyn leaned back slowly in her expensive leather chair. She steepled her fingers together and stared intensely at the mountain of criminal evidence covering her beautiful conference table. The silence in the glass room was incredibly heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp, cold, and decisive, like the loud crack of a heavy whip. "Thomas," she said, leaning forward and looking directly into my tired eyes. "What you and Mike have brought me here tonight goes far beyond a simple case of elder abuse or a greedy family dispute over retirement money. You have just handed me the master key to dismantle a massive, highly organized federal criminal syndicate." She explained the gravity of the situation with clinical precision. Tasha medical fraud alone involved millions of dollars in stolen federal funds, which immediately triggered federal jurisdiction. Tasha and Jamal were crossing state lines with illegal wire transfers. Jamal was deeply entangled with violent organized crime syndicates that the federal government had been trying to aggressively dismantle for years. And my treacherous daughter Chloe was absolutely guilty of aggravated assault, attempted manslaughter by poisoning, and federal conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Evelyn reached across the table and grabbed her cell phone. She told us she was not just going to build a simple legal defense to protect my $2 million retirement fund. She said playing defense was only for helpless victims, and I was clearly no longer a helpless victim. She made a phone call right then and there in the middle of the night. She called a direct, highly confidential contact she had inside the Chicago field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was a high-ranking special agent named Robert Miller, who specialized specifically in major white-collar crime and massive federal healthcare fraud. Evelyn put the phone on speaker so we could all hear. She briefly outlined the massive pile of physical evidence sitting on her table. She mentioned the forged legal documents, the clear, high-definition video of the chemical poisoning, and the direct financial connection to Tasha facility. The deep voice on the other end of the line went completely silent for a very long moment, before Agent Miller simply asked for the exact address of the office building. Less than 45 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open. Agent Miller walked in wearing a dark winter trench coat over a wrinkled suit. He looked physically exhausted, like a man who worked too many late nights, but his sharp eyes immediately locked onto the thick files and the glowing laptop screen. For the next 3 long hours, we sat in that secure room and went through every single terrible detail of the conspiracy. We watched the sickening video of my poisoning over and over again, pausing to note the exact brand of the heavy sedatives Chloe was using. We traced the illegal money flowing from Tasha's fraudulent medical claims directly into Jamal's secret bank accounts to pay off his gambling debts. Agent Miller explained that the federal government had been quietly building a very loose, circumstantial case against Tasha for over 2 years. They knew she was stealing millions, but they had never been able to find the hard physical evidence or a willing inside witness to completely break her dark operation wide open. My hidden teddy bear camera and Mike's relentless private investigation had just handed the FBI absolutely everything they needed, wrapped in a perfect, undeniable bow. Agent Miller looked at me across the table with a profound sense of respect. He told me I was one of the bravest men he had ever met in his entire career. I quickly shook my head and corrected him. I told him I was not brave at all. I was just a desperate, broken-hearted grandfather terrified of losing his precious little girl to a family of heartless monsters. I told Evelyn and Agent Miller all about Lily. I told them about her bright yellow sunflower paintings, her sweet laugh, and the beautiful way she called me Papa Bear. I made it absolutely undeniably clear that my only condition for handing over all this federal evidence was that I must be granted full, undisputed legal custody of my granddaughter the very moment the heavy hammer fell. Evelyn Hayes nodded her head firmly. She promised me she would draft the emergency federal custody orders herself and have them signed by a judge long before the trap was sprung. Then Evelyn laid out the master legal strategy. It was a plan so perfectly calculated and so utterly devastating that it made my old mechanic heart swell with dark, vengeful pride. We were not going to cancel the doctor appointment next Friday. We were not going to warn Chloe or Jamal that we knew about their evil plot. We were going to let them believe their horrific plan was working flawlessly right up until the very last terrible second. Evelyn explained the law to me in terms I could easily understand. In order to secure the absolute maximum federal prison sentences for all of them, we needed them to physically cross the point of no return. We needed them to proudly present the forged power of attorney with the clear intent to execute the massive fraud. We needed them to bring the fake medical diagnosis into a room and try to legally steal my life on paper. We needed to catch them completely red-handed in the exact moment of their greatest arrogant triumph. I agreed without a single moment of hesitation. I was more than willing to walk directly into the dark jaws of the beast if it meant I could violently pull its teeth out from the inside. We spent the rest of the early morning hours finalizing the intricate details of the trap. We coordinated the exact timing of the massive federal raid. We planned every single word I would say and every single move I would make when I finally dropped my act. When I finally walked out of that massive glass building and stepped back out into the freezing Chicago wind, the sun was just beginning to rise over the dark waters of Lake Michigan. My heavy body was completely exhausted. My ruined knees ached terribly from sitting so long, and my thick hands were numb from the bitter cold. But my tired soul felt incredibly light and powerful. The pathetic, drugged old man they thought I was had just built a massive, inescapable iron cage around them. I climbed up into the cab of my heavy diesel truck and started the loud engine. I knew I had to get back home and put my oversized, ragged clothes back on. I had to go back to being the helpless, drooling victim for just a few more agonizing days. But the absolute terror I had felt just a week ago standing outside their kitchen window was completely gone. I was no longer fighting alone. I was backed by a brilliant bulldog lawyer and the full crushing weight of the federal government. The wolves thought they were hunting an old, weak sheep. They had absolutely no idea the sheep was leading them directly into an industrial slaughterhouse from which they would never, ever return. The morning after my secret midnight meeting with Evelyn Hayes and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, I woke up with a singular burning purpose. For 40 years, I had built my entire life around providing for my daughter. Every aching muscle, every ruined joint, and every drop of dark grease scrubbed from my skin had been for Chloe. But that chapter of my life was completely and permanently closed. Now every single breath I took was dedicated to protecting my 7-year-old granddaughter Lily. The very first step in Evelyn's master plan was to completely remove the grand prize from the board. Chloe and Jamal were risking federal prison sentences because they desperately wanted my $2 million retirement fund. They thought that money was just sitting in my standard bank accounts, waiting for them to forge my signature and sweep it all away. I had to make absolutely certain that when they finally reached their greedy hands into the cookie jar, they would find absolutely nothing but cold, empty air. I did not go to my usual local bank branch in the suburbs. I knew the tellers there. They knew Chloe, and I could not risk a casual phone call ruining the entire operation. Instead, I drove my heavy truck deep into the downtown financial district of Chicago. I walked into a massive, echoing bank vault of a building wearing my clean church clothes so they would take me seriously. I sat down in a private, glass-walled office with a senior wealth manager. I handed him my identification and gave him a direct, unyielding order. I told him to completely liquidate every single financial asset attached to my name. I closed my checking accounts, my high-yield savings accounts, and my massive retirement portfolios. I even cashed out the expensive life insurance policy I had paid into every single month since my wife Sarah passed away. It took hours of signing heavy stacks of digital paperwork. The wealth manager looked at me with deep concern, asking if I was absolutely sure I wanted to move $2 million in liquid cash all at once. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I had never been more sure of anything in my entire 68 years on this earth. The moment the funds were completely cleared and pooled into a single secure holding account, I drove straight to Evelyn Elegant Law Office. She had been working through the night to draft the most aggressive, bulletproof financial fortress the law could possibly allow. It was called an irrevocable trust. Evelyn sat across from me at her polished mahogany table and explained exactly what that heavy legal term meant. When you put your money into a standard trust, you can still change your mind. You can move the money around, or a person with a power of attorney can access it. But an irrevocable trust is a completely different beast. Once I signed my name on that dotted line and transferred my $2 million into that specific trust, the money legally ceased to be mine. It belonged entirely to the trust itself. I could not take it back, and more importantly, no one else could ever touch it. It did not matter if Chloe walked into a bank next Friday with a forged power of attorney, a fake medical diagnosis, or a loaded gun. The bank would simply laugh in her face. The money was permanently locked away in an impenetrable legal vault. But the absolute genius of Evelyn's plan was in the precise details of how the trust was managed. I did not name myself as the trustee. I did not name any family members or close friends who could be bullied, manipulated, or threatened by Jamal and his violent associates. Instead, Evelyn appointed a massive, faceless corporate banking institution as the neutral third-party trustee. If Chloe or Jamal ever tried to demand a single red cent from that fund, they would not be dealing with a tired old mechanic they could easily intimidate. They would be forced to fight an army of ruthless corporate lawyers who protected that money with cold, mechanical efficiency. Jamal could scream and threaten all he wanted, but a massive financial institution does not care about his gambling debts or his fake real estate agency. They were completely and legally locked out of my wealth forever. Then came the most important part of the entire document: the sole beneficiary of the irrevocable trust. I picked up Evelyn's expensive silver pen and carefully signed my thick, calloused name on the final page. I officially designated my beautiful granddaughter Lily Gallagher as the one and only recipient of my entire life work. But Evelyn made sure the money was heavily protected even from Lily's own parents. The legal stipulations were incredibly strict. The corporate trustee was only authorized to release funds directly to educational institutions for Lily college tuition, or directly to medical providers for her health care. When Lily finally turned 25 years old, she would receive a modest monthly stipend to help her buy a home and start her life. Chloe and Jamal would never see a single penny of it. They could not use the money to pay off the underground sports bookies. They could not use it to take luxury vacations to Europe. The money that I had bled for under freezing diesel trucks would serve only one pure purpose. It would ensure that my sweet little angel would always be safe, warm, and fully provided for long after my old bones were buried in the ground. Signing that trust document lifted a massive, crushing weight off my heavy chest. The financial bait was officially secured, but the money was only half of the battle. The money could secure Lily's future, but it could not protect her immediate physical safety. Jamal was deeply in debt to violent, dangerous criminals who had threatened to burn his house down. Chloe was a cold-blooded sociopath who had proven she was perfectly willing to poison a family member to get what she wanted. And they were actively planning to exile Lily to a cheap, isolated boarding school hundreds of miles away. I could not allow my granddaughter to spend another unprotected night under their cursed roof once the trap finally sprang shut. Evelyn reached into her thick leather briefcase and pulled out a second stack of documents. These papers did not have bank logos on them. They bore the official heavy seal of the Illinois Family Court. These were emergency ex parte custody petitions. Evelyn explained that normally fighting for custody of a grandchild is a long, agonizing, and incredibly difficult legal battle. The courts almost always favor the biological parents, but our situation was not normal. We were not arguing about parenting styles or weekend visitation schedules. We were dealing with severe, documented, and life-threatening child endangerment. The custody documents Evelyn had drafted were completely devastating. They outlined every single horrific detail of the criminal conspiracy. The petition stated clearly that Chloe Gallagher was actively poisoning her elderly father with heavy, unprescribed narcotics in the very same kitchen where she prepared her daughter meals. It detailed Jamal's massive illegal gambling debts and the direct violent threats from organized crime syndicates that put Lily in immediate physical danger just by sleeping in her own bedroom. It also included the sworn testimony of Mike Sullivan, the private investigator, regarding the plot to abandon the child at an out-of-state facility so the parents could flee the jurisdiction with stolen funds. Evelyn had already taken the hidden teddy bear camera footage and the financial dossiers to a trusted family court judge in a closed-door, highly confidential emergency hearing. The judge had watched the high-definition video of Chloe crushing the toxic pills. The judge had seen the photographs of Jamal meeting with violent loan sharks in dark parking lots. The evidence was so overwhelmingly severe, and the danger to Lily was so incredibly imminent that the judge did not even hesitate. Evelyn slid the final page across the mahogany table. It was an official court order signed and stamped by the judge just an hour before I arrived. It granted me immediate full and sole temporary physical and legal custody of Lily Gallagher. The order was legally binding the very second the FBI placed Chloe and Jamal in handcuffs next Friday. Furthermore, the judge had sealed the entire petition. Chloe and Jamal had absolutely no idea this legal atomic bomb had already been dropped. They would not receive a single warning. They would not get a court summons in the mail. They would simply walk into that trap, expecting to become millionaires, and they would walk out in heavy steel chains, permanently stripped of their parental rights. I reached out and touched the judge's signature on the heavy paper. My thick fingers trembled, but this time it was not an act. It was a tremor of profound, overwhelming relief. I thought about the terrible day Lily had run out of the living room crying, believing her Papa Bear had completely forgotten her name. I had broken her little heart to maintain my cover, and the guilt had been eating me alive from the inside out. But looking at this signed custody order, I knew that terrible sacrifice had been absolutely necessary. I had traded one moment of her tears for a lifetime of her absolute safety. I looked up at Evelyn Hayes. The fierce bulldog lawyer gave me a slow, deeply respectful nod. The fortress is completely built. Thomas, she said quietly, the money is gone. The child is legally yours. There is absolutely nothing left for them to steal. Now all we have to do is wait for them to walk through the front door of the slaughterhouse. I gathered the thick copies of the legal documents and placed them securely inside my heavy canvas jacket. I walked out of the towering office building and stepped into the busy streets of downtown Chicago. The freezing winter wind whipped against my weathered face, but I did not feel the bitter cold. I felt an incredible burning heat radiating from my chest. I was a 68-year-old retired diesel mechanic. I had bad knees, a ruined back, and hands that constantly ached from 40 years of brutal manual labor. My daughter and my son-in-law had looked at my broken body and seen nothing but a weak, pathetic target. They thought my love for them made me a foolish, gullible old man. They were completely wrong. My love was not a weakness. It was the absolute strongest, most indestructible material on the face of the earth. I had quietly taken my $2 million and built a titanium shield around my granddaughter. I had taken the law and forged it into a heavy steel sword. They were spending their days gleefully planning how they would spend my life savings, completely unaware that the vault was already empty and the heavy iron doors had already been locked and welded shut from the outside. The old wolf had secured his precious cub. Now there was absolutely nothing left to do but wait for Friday morning and let the righteous hammer of absolute justice fall down upon their heads. The hardest part of laying a trap for a wild animal is holding perfectly still while the beast sniffs the bait. You cannot breathe too heavily. You cannot blink. You have to completely mask your own scent and let the animal believe it is in absolute control of the environment. By Wednesday morning, my body was entirely exhausted from the heavy burden of playing the role of a dying man. My muscles ached from intentionally hunching my shoulders, and my throat was dry from forcing my voice into a pathetic, raspy whisper. But my mind was sharper than a heavy steel blade. I had the sealed custody papers safely hidden in my garage. My $2 million were locked away behind an impenetrable wall of corporate lawyers. The grand prize they were willing to kill for no longer existed. Now I just needed to guide them directly into the center of the slaughterhouse without them ever realizing the doors had already been locked behind them. I drove my heavy truck to their house that morning under a sky the color of bruised iron. The Chicago wind was howling violently, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees lining their perfect suburban street. I parked in the driveway and sat in the cab for a few long moments, gripping the heavy steering wheel. I closed my eyes and summoned every single ounce of grief and fear I could possibly muster. I needed to look like a man who had finally surrendered to the dark void. I needed to look like a proud father who was willingly falling on his own sword. I walked through the front door and shuffled slowly into the bright kitchen. Jamal was sitting at the marble island, furiously typing on his cell phone. He looked terrible. There were deep, dark circles under his eyes, and his hands were shaking slightly. The violent sports bookies were clearly running out of patience, tightening the invisible noose around his neck. Chloe was standing by the sink holding the familiar orange prescription bottle ready to crush the heavy sedatives into my morning coffee. When she saw me walk in, she quickly slipped the bottle back into her pocket and put on her fake, sickly sweet smile. "Good morning, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "You were up early today." I did not answer her right away. I let my shoulders slump forward, and I slowly lowered myself into a heavy wooden chair at the dining table. I stared down at my thick, scarred hands, letting them tremble violently against the polished wood. I took a deep, ragged breath that sounded like a dry death rattle. I looked up at her, and then I looked at Jamal. "We need to talk," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "I need both of you to sit down and listen to me." Jamal locked his phone and exchanged a quick, nervous glance with my daughter. They walked over and sat across from me. The air in the room grew incredibly thick and tense. They thought I was going to complain about my memory again, or maybe cry about dropping another ceramic plate. They had absolutely no idea they were about to be handed the greatest illusion of their miserable lives. "I know what is happening to me," I said, forcing heavy, thick tears to well up in my tired eyes. "I am not a stupid man. I've fixed complicated engines for 40 years. I know when a machine is breaking down past the point of repair. My mind is slipping away, Chloe. I can feel the heavy fog rolling in every single day. Half the time, I do not even know what day of the week it is. I am forgetting things. I am dropping things. I am losing my grip on reality, and I am absolutely terrified." Chloe reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin felt completely ice cold. "Oh, Dad," she cooed, rubbing my knuckles. "It is going to be okay. That is exactly why we made that appointment with Tasha's specialist for this Friday. The doctor is going to give you the right medication to help your memory. We are going to take excellent care of you." I shook my head slowly, letting the tears spill over my weathered cheeks. "No," I sobbed loudly, pulling my hand away from her toxic touch. "I am not going to any doctor. I refuse to sit in a cold, sterile examination room and have a stranger in a white coat look at me with pity. I refuse to hear them say the word Alzheimer out loud. I am too proud for that. I have worked way too hard my entire life to be officially labeled as a crazy, incompetent old fool on a piece of medical paper." Jamal leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. The panic in his chest was practically visible. He needed that medical diagnosis to trigger the forced conservatorship. If I refused to go to the doctor, his entire plan to steal my money and pay off his violent debts would completely collapse. "Dad, you have to go to that appointment," Jamal said, his voice tight and desperate. "We cannot manage your health if we do not have an official diagnosis. It is for your own good." I looked at my son-in-law and I played my ultimate trump card. "I know it is for my own good, Jamal," I said. my voice suddenly dropping into a tone of quiet, defeated resignation. And I know I cannot manage my own affairs anymore. I am dangerous to myself. But I want to do this my way. I want to handle this with the dignity of a man who provides for his family. I do not want a court to force me into anything. I want to give it to you voluntarily. The entire room went completely dead silent. The only sound was the howling winter wind beating against the kitchen windows. Chloe and Jamal stared at me, their mouths slightly open in absolute shock. "What are you saying?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling with barely contained greed. I took another ragged breath and wiped my wet face with the back of my flannel sleeve. "I am saying that I trust you." I lied, the words tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. "I trust you and Jamal to do the right thing for me and for little Lily." Before my mind completely rots away, while I still have a few moments of clarity left, I want to legally sign everything over to you. I want to sign a durable power of attorney. I want to transfer the $2 million in my retirement accounts directly into your control. I want you to have the house. I want you to have absolute authority over my medical care. I watched their faces very closely. It was like watching two starving vultures staring at a massive bloody carcass. The pure, unadulterated shock was rapidly being replaced by an overwhelming, intoxicating surge of arrogant joy. They were practically vibrating with excitement. This was their absolute wildest dream come true. They did not have to drag a fighting, screaming old man into a fake medical evaluation. They did not have to risk a messy, drawn-out court battle over a forced conservatorship. The foolish old sheep was willingly walking right up to the butcher block and offering his own neck to the sharp blade. But there is one strict condition, I added quickly, my voice hardening just a fraction to make it sound believable. I am a man of old-fashioned business. I do not want to sign away my entire life savings on a kitchen counter. If we are going to do this, we are going to do it formally. We are going to do it right. I want to go to a professional law office. Jamal, you told me about that sharp real estate lawyer you used downtown, the one in that fancy glass building. I want to go to his office this Friday morning instead of the doctor clinic. Have him draw up the heavy legal papers. I will sit at a proper mahogany desk, and I will sign my life over to you in front of legal witnesses. Jamal's eyes grew completely wide. He was calculating the unbelievable luck of this situation. He already had his corrupt lawyer lined up. He already had the forged power of attorney documents printed and waiting in that exact same office. All he had to do was swap my voluntary idea for his malicious trap, and he would have the legal cover he desperately needed. The violent bookies would be paid by Monday morning. Jamal looked at Chloe, a massive, greedy grin spreading across his face. He nodded his head vigorously. "Absolutely, Dad." Jamal said, his voice practically shaking with dark excitement. "If that is how you want to handle it, we completely respect your wishes. I will call my lawyer right now and cancel the doctor appointment. We will set everything up for Friday morning at his office. We will make sure everything is handled with the utmost dignity." Chloe stood up from her chair and walked around the table. She wrapped her arms around my heavy shoulders and hugged me tightly. "Oh, Dad," she whispered, burying her face into my neck. "You are making the best decision. We are going to take such good care of you. You will never have to worry about a single thing ever again." I sat there in the wooden chair, letting the woman who was actively poisoning my coffee hug me. I endured the sickening touch of her arms, knowing it would be the absolute last time she would ever put her hands on me. I kept my face buried in my hands, pretending to weep tears of sorrow and relief. But hidden behind my thick, calloused fingers, completely shielded from their greedy eyes, I was not crying at all. I was smiling. It was a cold, hard, and terrifying smile. The trap had just snapped completely shut. The bait had been swallowed whole. They thought my sudden surrender was a stroke of brilliant luck. They were so utterly blinded by their own desperate greed and their arrogant cruelty that they failed to ask a single logical question. They did not stop to wonder why an old mechanic would suddenly change his mind. They only saw the flashing dollar signs and the promise of ultimate freedom. They were going to walk into that sleek, glass-walled law office on Friday morning, expecting to become instant millionaires. They were going to bring their corrupt lawyer and their forged documents, completely unaware that Evelyn Hayes, a bulldog federal attorney, was waiting in the shadows. They did not know that the $2 million they were already spending in their heads was permanently locked away in an irrevocable trust. They did not know that a federal family court judge had already signed away their rights to ever see little Lily again. And most importantly, they had absolutely no idea that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was already fully briefed, heavily armed, and patiently waiting to kick the heavy wooden doors of that law office completely off their hinges. I slowly stood up from the table, playing the part of the exhausted old man one final time. I told them I needed to go back to my house and rest my tired mind before the big day on Friday. Jamal practically skipped to the front door to hold it open for me, treating me like royalty now that I was handing him the keys to the kingdom. I walked down the driveway and climbed into my heavy diesel truck. As I drove away from their perfect suburban house, I looked at it in my rearview mirror. The illusion of my perfect family was completely dead and buried. But the old wolf was fully alive, and Friday morning was going to be a bloodbath of absolute justice. Friday morning arrived with a bitter, freezing chill that swept off the dark waters of Lake Michigan and cut through the bustling streets of the city. I sat quietly in the passenger seat of Jamal's luxury leased car, staring blankly out the tinted window as we drove deep into the financial heart of downtown Chicago. I wore my oversized, faded flannel shirt and my severely scuffed work boots. I had intentionally skipped shaving for 3 days, and my silver hair was completely uncombed. I wanted to look exactly like the defeated, pathetic old mechanic they believed they had finally broken. Jamal gripped the leather steering wheel with white knuckles, driving a little too fast, his eyes constantly darting to the digital clock on the dashboard. He was a desperate, terrified man racing toward his own twisted salvation. The violent sports bookies were breathing heavily down his neck, and he needed my life savings by the end of the day. Chloe sat comfortably in the back seat, humming a soft, cheerful tune, completely unbothered by the fact that she was happily driving her own father to a legal slaughterhouse. When we finally pulled into the dark underground parking garage of the towering glass skyscraper, the air inside the car felt incredibly heavy and suffocating. Jamal practically jumped out of the driver's seat, rushing around to open my door with fake, exaggerated politeness. I let my legs buckle slightly as I stepped out onto the cold concrete, forcing Jamal to catch me by the arm to keep me from falling. He gripped my bicep a little too tightly, his fingers digging painfully into my skin with greedy anticipation. He was treating me like a massive bag of stolen cash that he needed to carefully carry across the finish line. We rode the silent, mirrored elevator up to the 50th floor. When the polished silver doors finally slid open, we stepped into a world of absolute sterile wealth that I had never belonged to. The law office was a massive expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass windows, white marble floors, and modern leather furniture. It was the kind of elite place that charged thousands of dollars an hour just to breathe the conditioned air. It was a place designed specifically to intimidate working-class people like me, a place where men in expensive suits casually signed away the lives of hard-working people. A young woman in a sharp designer skirt greeted us with a stiff professional smile and led us down a long, quiet hallway to a massive corner office. Sitting behind a breathtaking expanse of polished mahogany wood was Jamal, corrupt attorney. He was a slick, handsome man with perfectly styled silver hair and a tailored navy blue suit. He stood up as we walked in and extended a perfectly manicured hand, flashing a bright, predatory smile that did not reach his cold, dead eyes. He looked at me not as a human being with a soul, but as a walking gold mine, ready to be completely harvested. I did not take the lawyer hand. I let my head loll heavily to the side, staring blankly at a large, confusing, abstract painting on the wall playing the heavily sedated fool to absolute perfection. Chloe gently guided me by the shoulders and pushed me down into a deep, heavy leather chair positioned right in front of the massive desk. She pulled her own chair close to mine, resting her hand lightly on my knee. She had already started her sickening theatrical performance. Her eyes were bright with fake tears, and she wore an expression of deep, tragic sorrow. She looked exactly like the perfect devoted daughter making a heartbreaking, impossible decision for her rapidly failing father. Jamal sat on my other side, his leg bouncing up and down uncontrollably against the thick carpet. He could practically smell the $2 million. He could smell his total freedom from the violent men who wanted to break his legs. He was so incredibly close to the finish line he could barely breathe. The corrupt attorney cleared his throat loudly and folded his soft hands carefully on top of the polished mahogany desk. He spoke to me in a soft, sickeningly condescending voice, the exact kind of tone you would use to calm a frightened toddler. Thomas the lawyer said, leaning forward with a look of highly manufactured sympathy. Your daughter and your son-in-law have told me how incredibly difficult things have been for you lately. They love you very much. They want to make sure you are fully protected and properly cared for as your memory continues to decline. They told me you bravely decided to voluntarily sign over the management of your entire estate today so you can finally rest. I let out a low, confused groan, nodding my head slowly as if I barely understood the heavy words he was speaking. Inside my chest, my heart was beating with a slow, powerful, and incredibly steady rhythm. I was sitting in a room completely filled with venomous snakes, but I felt absolutely no fear whatsoever. I felt a cold, calculated sense of absolute justice brewing deep in my old bones. I listened silently as the attorney began to read the formal summary of the legal documents. He used complicated, confusing legal jargon, talking rapidly about durable powers, medical proxies, and total asset transfers. But I knew exactly what those fancy words really meant in the dark reality of this conspiracy. He was officially saying that Chloe would have the absolute legal right to drain my bank accounts by the end of the day. He was saying that Jamal's sister Tasha would have the legal authority to lock me in a padded room and pump my veins full of toxic chemical sedatives by nightfall. He was saying that Jamal could immediately pay off his illegal gambling debts with the money I had bled for on freezing concrete floors for 40 years. The lawyer finally finished his smooth, deceptive speech. He reached into a thick leather folder and pulled out a stack of crisp white legal documents. He laid them gently on the polished mahogany desk directly in front of me, squaring the corners perfectly. The heavy black letters at the very top of the page seemed to absorb all the light in the room. Durable power of attorney. It was the exact same forged document Mike Sullivan had shown me in his smoky office, only this time the signature line at the very bottom was completely blank. They needed my actual physical signature in front of the corrupt lawyer to make the massive theft completely bulletproof and legally binding. Jamal immediately stopped bouncing his leg. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a heavy, expensive gold pen. He uncapped it with a soft click and gently pressed the cold metal barrel directly into my thick, calloused palm. "Go ahead, Dad," Jamal whispered, his voice thick and vibrating with unadulterated greed. "Just sign your name on the dotted line. We will take care of absolutely everything from here on out. You will never have to worry about a single thing ever again." I stared down at the crisp white paper. I held the heavy gold pen in my right hand, my dark grease-stained knuckles contrasting sharply against the shiny metal. I began to shake. I let a violent, uncontrollable tremor travel all the way up my arm, making the gold pen tap loudly and erratically against the polished mahogany wood. I breathed heavily through my open mouth, letting out small, confused whimpers of pathetic defeat. I wanted to stretch this exact moment out for as long as humanly possible. I wanted them to fully experience the absolute peak of their arrogant, greedy triumph before I dragged them violently down into the dark abyss. I sat there trembling, staring at the blank line, thinking about everything that had led to this exact second. I thought about the thousands of freezing graveyard shifts I had worked under massive diesel trucks just to pay for Chloe private school. I thought about the hot gravy I had wiped off their kitchen floor on my hands and knees while they laughed at me. I thought about the toxic crushed pills they had fed me in my morning coffee. And most importantly, I thought about my beautiful little granddaughter Lily, who was currently sitting in her second-grade classroom, completely unaware that her parents were trying to sell her beloved Papa Bear into a chemical prison. I slowly lifted my heavy head and looked at the three monsters sitting around me. The corrupt attorney was subtly checking his expensive gold watch, clearly bored with the old man. Slow, trembling movements, completely eager to collect his massive illegal fee and move on to his next wealthy victim. Then I looked directly at my daughter. Chloe was delicately dabbing the corner of her eye with a pristine white tissue, playing the weeping angel perfectly for the lawyer. But when she lowered the tissue, she looked straight into my eyes. She thought my mind was completely destroyed by the heavy sedatives she had crushed into my coffee just a few hours ago. She thought I was nothing more than a hollow, obedient shell. She looked right past me, making direct, meaningful eye contact with her husband. And right there in the quiet, sterile air of that expensive glass office, I saw it. It was the exact same sickening smirk she had worn in the kitchen. Jamal returned the smile, his eyes practically glowing with dark, victorious malice. They were silently congratulating each other across my hunched back. They thought they had officially won the war. They thought they had successfully slaughtered the weak old sheep completely and utterly unaware of the massive iron jaws currently closing around their throats. I stared down at the blank black line printed at the very bottom of the crisp white paper. The heavy gold pen hovered just an inch above the surface of the mahogany desk. I was forcing my right hand to tremble violently. My knuckles were white from the effort of playing the pathetic victim. Jamal was sitting completely still next to me. I could actually hear the shallow, rapid breaths whistling through his nose. He was practically vibrating with desperate anticipation. Chloe had her hand resting gently on my knee, playing the role of the weeping, heartbroken daughter for the corrupt lawyer sitting across from us. The sleek, glass-walled office was completely silent except for the faint hum of the expensive air conditioning system. They were waiting for me to make the final fatal stroke. They were waiting for me to legally erase my own existence. And then I simply stopped. I commanded the violent tremor in my right arm to completely vanish. The heavy gold pen in my hand became perfectly still. The sudden lack of movement was so jarring that Chloe's hand twitched on my knee. I stopped hunching my tired shoulders. I took a very slow, very deep breath of the cold, sterile office air. I pushed my chest out and straightened my back, pulling myself up until I was sitting as tall and as broad as a man who had spent 40 years lifting heavy steel truck transmissions. I slowly turned my head and looked directly into my daughter's face. The cloudy, confused fog I had been faking in my eyes for an entire week completely evaporated. My eyes turned into chips of solid, freezing ice. The sudden silence in the room became incredibly heavy. The corrupt lawyer stopped checking his expensive watch and frowned. Jamal leaned forward, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Dad." Jamal said, his voice laced with a sudden creeping uncertainty. "What are you waiting for? Just sign the paper so we can go home." I did not answer him. I opened my thick, calloused fingers and let the expensive gold pen drop from my hand. It hit the polished mahogany wood with a loud, sharp clatter. The pen rolled away from the forged legal documents and fell right off the edge of the desk, dropping soundlessly onto the thick carpet. "I am not signing anything," I said. My voice was no longer a pathetic, raspy whisper. It was a deep, gravelly rumble that echoed powerfully off the thick glass walls. It was the heavy voice of a veteran diesel mechanic. It was the voice of a father who had completely run out of mercy. Chloe dropped her pristine white tissue. The fake tears completely vanished from her beautiful face, instantly replaced by a look of absolute paralyzing shock. She looked down at my perfectly steady hands, and then she looked up into my cold, unyielding eyes. "Dad," she stammered, her voice trembling for real this time. "Are you okay? You are acting really strange. The medicine must be wearing off." I reached inside the deep inner pocket of my oversized canvas jacket. I did not pull out a handkerchief to wipe my tears. I pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. I slammed it down right on top of their forged, durable power of attorney. The heavy thud made the corrupt lawyer physically jump in his leather chair. I rested my dark, grease-stained hands flat on top of the folder. "I am acting exactly like a man who knows exactly what you put in his coffee this morning, Chloe," I said. My voice was dangerously calm, devoid of any shouting or rage. It was the terrifying calm of a man holding a loaded weapon. The color completely drained from Chloe's face. She turned as pale as a sheet of white paper. She looked like she had just seen a ghost rise up from the grave. And in a very real way, she had. The helpless, senile old victim she thought she had successfully created was completely dead. The man sitting next to her was her absolute worst nightmare. I flipped the heavy manila folder open. I took the first thick stack of high-definition photographs and slid them slowly across the smooth mahogany wood directly into her lap. "Take a really good look at those pictures," I commanded her. The glossy photographs were crystal clear. They showed Chloe standing in her own bright suburban kitchen. They showed her clearly holding the small orange prescription bottle. They showed her crushing the heavy chemical sedatives with the back of a silver spoon and sweeping the toxic white powder directly into my favorite ceramic coffee mug. You thought you were so incredibly clever. I continued, my voice relentless and steady. You thought I was just clumsily dropping dinner plates on your floor and forgetting my own granddaughter name because I was old and naturally broken. You did not know I bought a high-definition micro camera. You did not know I hid that camera deep inside the soft brown teddy bear I gave to my beautiful little Lily. You did not know I sat in my dark garage and watched you systematically poison my brain every single day. I watched you chemically assault your own father just so you could steal the money I bled on freezing concrete floors to earn for your future. Chloe began to shake uncontrollably. She tried to speak, but her throat was completely closed with pure terror. Only small, pathetic gasping sounds came out of her open mouth. She pushed the glossy photographs off her lap as if they were literally covered in burning acid. They scattered all over the floor. Jamal suddenly jumped up from his leather chair. His face was a twisted mask of pure panic and violent rage. "This is a complete setup," Jamal shouted, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are a crazy old man. You have completely lost your mind. We are leaving right now." I turned my icy gaze away from my daughter and locked my eyes directly onto my son-in-law. I reached back into the thick folder and pulled out the second massive stack of evidence. I threw the papers and photographs across the desk so hard they slid right to the edge. "Sit down and shut your mouth, Jamal," I growled, my voice vibrating with absolute crushing authority. "Or the violent sports bookies you owe $500,000 to will be the absolute least of your miserable problems." Jamal froze completely solid. His knees gave out beneath him and he collapsed heavily back into his chair. He stared in absolute horror at the pictures scattered before him. There were grainy surveillance photographs showing him standing in dark parking lots, looking completely terrified while talking to massive, dangerous thugs. There were printed bank statements exposing his fake hollow real estate agency and his massive, crippling credit card debts. "You needed my $2 million to save your own pathetic life," I said, verbally, dismantling him piece by painful piece. "You needed my hard-earned money to pay off the underground gambling syndicate before those violent men burned your beautiful suburban house straight to the ground. You convinced my greedy, soulless daughter to drug me and lock me in a padded room so you could steal my entire retirement fund. You thought I was a foolish old sheep, but you forgot one very important thing. A man who spends 40 years building and repairing heavy machinery knows exactly how to tear a broken system completely apart." The corrupt lawyer behind the desk was hyperventilating. He scrambled out of his expensive leather chair, desperately reaching his soft hands forward to sweep the forged legal documents off his desk. He wanted to destroy the hard evidence of his own criminal involvement. I reached out with lightning speed and slammed my heavy calloused hand down onto his wrist, pinning his arm painfully against the solid mahogany wood. "Do not even think about touching those papers," I warned him, leaning forward until my face was only inches from his. My eyes burned right through his cowardly soul. "Those forged documents are now classified as federal evidence, and if you move a single muscle, I will personally make sure you share a tiny concrete prison cell with Tasha Richards." At the direct mention of Jamal's older sister, the entire room went completely dead still. The air felt like it had been sucked right out of the room. I let go of the lawyer wrist and pulled the third and final stack of documents from my thick folder. These papers were completely different from the others. They bore the heavy, intimidating seals of the federal government and the Office of Inspector General. I slid the massive stack of federal indictments to the exact center of the table. "I know absolutely everything about Tasha and her medical house of horrors," I said, dropping the final, devastating hammer. "I know all about the millions of dollars in severe Medicare fraud. I know about the fake phantom illnesses and the corrupt medical doctors you hired to falsely diagnose me with severe Alzheimer's disease this afternoon. I know about the locked ward where you planned to keep me heavily sedated and hidden away until my heart finally stopped beating. I know you were going to throw my innocent little Lily into a cheap boarding school 2 states away so you could travel the world spending my stolen money. I sat back heavily in the deep leather chair, looking at the absolute devastation I had just unleashed upon them. I had completely ripped their fake masks off and exposed the rotting evil monsters hiding underneath. Chloe was weeping hysterically, her face buried deep in her trembling hands, her perfect illusion totally shattered. Jamal was staring blankly at the glass wall, completely paralyzed by the realization that his life was entirely over. The slick lawyer was shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, completely trapped in his own office. "You wanted me to voluntarily sign my life away," I said quietly into the terrible silence. "You wanted me to walk willingly right into your legal slaughterhouse. Well, here I am. But I did not come here to surrender my life to you. I came here to execute the final judgment. You built an entire criminal empire on the broken backs of vulnerable people, but you made one massive fatal mistake. You tried to build your final trap around a father who would gladly burn the entire world down to protect his granddaughter." I did not even have to wait for the corrupt lawyer to respond to my final warning. As if the universe itself had been holding its breath, waiting for my exact cue, the heavy oak doors of the corner office were suddenly and violently thrown wide open. The loud explosive crash of the thick wood hitting the glass walls shattered the sterile silence of the room like a bomb going off. A massive tidal wave of dark tactical gear, heavy bulletproof vests, and flashing gold badges flooded directly into the sleek space. Special Agent Robert Miller led the overwhelming charge, flanked by half a dozen heavily armed federal agents and several uniformed officers from the Chicago Police Department. They moved with a terrifying, coordinated speed that instantly sucked all the oxygen straight out of the room. The quiet, arrogant atmosphere of the elite law office was instantly replaced by the deafening shouts of law enforcement taking absolute control. It was a beautiful, chaotic display of inescapable justice finally coming to collect its heavy toll. Jamal leaped out of his expensive leather chair like a frightened animal caught violently in a steel snare. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. For a split second, his body tensed, as if his primal instincts were telling him to fight his way out or run straight for the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. But he was completely surrounded. He had absolutely nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. Two massive federal agents lunged forward and hit him like a runaway freight train. Jamal let out a sharp, pathetic gasp as he was violently tackled directly to the thick office carpet. The expensive tailored suit he wore to project his fake wealth was brutally twisted and crushed against the floor. An agent planted a heavy, unyielding knee squarely between his shoulder blades, pinning him face down with crushing physical force. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed sharply over the shouting. Agent Miller stood towering over him, his deep voice booming with absolute terrifying authority as he began to read the federal charges. "Jamal Richards, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, felony extortion, and conspiracy to commit grand theft." Jamal pressed his face deep into the carpet, completely paralyzed by the sudden violent destruction of his entire world. The arrogant, smooth-talking real estate agent who had gleefully planned to lock me in a chemical prison was completely and utterly gone. He was nothing but a pathetic, broken criminal whimpering on the floor. You could see the exact moment the horrific reality finally crashed down upon him. He fully realized that he was going to spend the absolute best years of his life rotting away in a cold concrete federal penitentiary, completely exposed and entirely defenseless against the violent underground bookies he owed $500,000 to. His future was nothing but iron bars and absolute terror. The corrupt attorney sitting behind the polished mahogany desk did not put up any sort of physical fight. He was a spineless coward who only knew how to hide safely behind expensive wooden desks and forged legal papers. When a stern-faced Chicago police officer marched around the desk, grabbed his soft arm and yanked him roughly out of his leather chair, the lawyer immediately started sweating profusely. He began babbling frantically about his constitutional rights attorney-client privilege and demanding to make a phone call. Agent Miller calmly stepped forward and shoved a thick stamped federal warrant directly into his chest. The agent loudly informed the trembling lawyer that his entire law practice was currently being seized as an active federal crime scene. Agent Miller also took a moment to announce to the room that a secondary heavily armed FBI strike team was currently at this very exact second kicking down the heavy locked doors of Tasha Richards' private assisted living facility completely across town. Tasha was currently being dragged out of her medical house of horrors in heavy steel chains, her multi-million-dollar Medicare fraud empire completely burning to the ground, and her innocent elderly victims finally being rescued. The corrupt lawyer knees instantly buckled. He began to sob as he was dragged out of his own beautiful office in handcuffs, his lucrative legal career and his luxurious freedom completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. And then there was Chloe. My own flesh and blood. The woman who had crushed toxic pills into my morning coffee with a bright, cheerful smile. She had scrambled backward, practically climbing over the leather chairs, pressing her back desperately against the cold glass window as if she could somehow fuse with the building and disappear into thin air. A female police officer approached her rapidly, holding a pair of gleaming steel handcuffs ready. Chloe began to hyperventilate violently. The fake theatrical tears she had been crying just moments ago for the lawyer benefit were instantly replaced by real, hysterical, ugly panic. Her pristine white sweater heaved as she gasped desperately for air. The female officer grabbed Chloe's wrists, pulled them roughly behind her back with practiced force, and locked the cold steel cuffs tightly in place. "Chloe Gallagher," the officer said loudly, her voice cutting through the remaining chaos in the room, reading the horrific charges that would permanently ruin her life. "You are under arrest for aggravated assault, severe elder abuse, and attempted manslaughter by poisoning." Chloe completely broke down. Her legs simply gave out beneath her, and the police officer had to physically hold her up by her trapped arms to keep her from collapsing onto the floor. She looked wildly around the room, her eyes darting frantically from the federal agents searching the desk to her handcuffed husband groveling on the floor before finally locking her terrified gaze onto me. She looked at me sitting completely calm and composed in the heavy leather chair. The cold, horrifying realization of exactly what I had accomplished finally crashed down upon her. I had brilliantly outsmarted her. I had endured her chemical torture and played the foolish victim to completely expose her evil to the entire world. She lunged forward against the tight grip of the police officer, thick black mascara tears streaming down her pale, terrified face. "Dad," she screamed. The sound tore through the sleek office, sharp, high-pitched, and incredibly desperate. "Daddy, please! You have to stop them. Tell them it is a massive mistake. I am your daughter. I am your little girl. You promised Mom you would always protect me. Please do not let them take me away to a prison cell. I am so sorry. I was just stressed. I will do anything you want. I will be good. Please save me." I slowly stood up from the deep leather chair. I did not hunch my tired shoulders. I did not fake a single tremor in my heavy hands. I stood at my full commanding height, towering over the absolute wreckage of their miserable lives. I walked slowly and deliberately across the thick carpet until I was standing just a few feet away from my weeping daughter. I looked down at her face, searching the very bottom of my own soul for even a single ounce of pity, a single drop of paternal mercy, or a single shred of the fatherly love I had carried for 34 years. But there was absolutely nothing left. The deep well of my unconditional love had been completely and permanently poisoned by her own greedy hands. The mention of her mother only cemented my absolute disgust. I looked directly into her terrified, crying eyes. My voice was completely steady, totally devoid of any anger, sorrow, or hesitation. It was the absolute freezing truth of a man who had finally cut out the cancer from his life. "You stopped being my daughter the moment you put poison in my cup. You will never see a dime, and you will never see Lily again." Chloe let out a gut-wrenching, agonizing shriek of pure, absolute devastation. It was the pathetic sound of a greedy soul being permanently condemned to the dark abyss she had dug with her own bare hands. She thrashed wildly against the strong police officer, screaming my name over and over again, begging for a second chance she absolutely did not deserve. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply turned my broad back on her and began walking toward the shattered wooden doors. Agent Miller placed a highly respectful hand on my heavy shoulder as I passed him. He gave me a slow, silent nod of profound understanding. A silent acknowledgement between two men who knew exactly what it took to take down the monsters of the world. I nodded back. I walked completely out of the glass-walled office, leaving the frantic, hysterical screams of my treacherous daughter and the pathetic whimpers of her criminal husband echoing behind me in the hallway. I stepped into the mirrored elevator and confidently pressed the button for the ground floor. As the heavy silver doors slid closed, cutting off the noise of the federal raid forever, an incredible, profound sense of peace washed over my entire body. The heavy, agonizing burden I had been carrying for the past grueling week completely vanished. My back no longer ached. My ruined knees felt incredibly light and strong. The old wolf had successfully hunted down the predators who threatened his family. The slaughterhouse was completely full, and the heavy iron doors were permanently locked. Now it was finally time to go home, wash the dark grease from my hands, and pick my beautiful granddaughter up from school to start our brand new life. 6 long months have passed since that freezing Friday morning in the towering glass office building. The wheels of the federal justice system moved with surprising and crushing speed when handed a mountain of undeniable video and financial evidence. Jamal is currently sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary, serving a hard 10-year sentence for wire fraud and extortion. I heard through the lawyers that his underground sports bookies are still eagerly waiting for the day he finally gets out. My own daughter Chloe pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and severe elder abuse to avoid a much longer and more humiliating public trial. She was sentenced to 5 years behind heavy iron bars. It breaks a very small, quiet part of my heart to know my own flesh and blood is locked inside a concrete cage, but it was the exact bed she willingly made for herself. Tasha Richards lost absolutely everything. Her medical facility was permanently shut down by the federal government. Her innocent elderly victims were safely relocated to proper care homes, and Tasha is currently serving 20 years for her massive Medicare fraud operation. The toxic cancer has been completely and permanently removed from our lives. As for me, the family court judge made my temporary custody order completely permanent. I have full, undisputed legal and physical custody of my beautiful granddaughter Lily. The $2 million remains safely locked away in the impenetrable, irrevocable trust, quietly growing and waiting for the day she needs it for her college education or her very first home. But we do not think about the money very much these days. We measure our true wealth in quiet mornings and peaceful afternoons. Right now I am sitting on my heavy wooden stool in my old cluttered garage. The heavy metal garage door is rolled wide open, and the bright, warm spring sunlight is pouring completely over the clean concrete floor. The bitter Chicago winter has finally melted away. Lily is sitting right next to me on her own little wooden stool. She is wearing her tiny plastic safety goggles and a pair of denim overalls covered in dark grease stains. We are working together to rebuild the small carburetor of an old classic model truck. She hands me a heavy steel wrench with a massive, beautiful smile on her face. Papa Bear. She says, her voice ringing like a beautiful silver bell over the sound of the distant neighborhood birds. Do you think this old engine will run today? I take the wrench from her tiny hand, look deep into her bright, innocent eyes, and tell her that as long as we put the broken pieces back together with genuine love and absolute care, it will run forever. She laughs loudly and goes right back to tightening a small brass bolt. The heavy dark shadow of fear that once hovered over us is completely gone. My small house is filled with her sweet laughter. Her bright yellow sunflower paintings cover every inch of my tall metal toolboxes, and my old mechanic heart is completely at peace. The nightmare is over, and our beautiful future is entirely secure. If there is one profound and unshakable lesson I have learned from this entire agonizing ordeal, it is that karma never misses an address. It might take a little extra time to process the heavy paperwork, but it always delivers the brutal bill directly to your front door. This is especially true when you try to sell out the very blood that raised you from a child. Family is supposed to be a sacred sanctuary. It is supposed to be the one truly safe place in this harsh, unforgiving world where you do not have to wear heavy iron armor just to survive. When you deliberately violate that sacred trust, when you look at the hardworking father who willingly sacrificed his own physical body to give you a comfortable life, and see nothing but a walking bank account, you completely strip yourself of the universe. Natural protection. Chloe and Jamal foolishly thought my deep, unconditional love made me totally blind. They thought because I was an aging diesel mechanic with bad knees, a ruined back, and a quiet demeanor, I would simply roll over and let them slaughter me in the dark. But they made a catastrophic and fatal miscalculation. You must never mistake an old man's silence for weakness. Sometimes that quiet silence is just the deep, calculating breath a fiercely protective father takes before he burns the entire forest down to protect his precious family. I did not fight back out of spite or blind hatred. I fought back out of a pure, ferocious, and unstoppable love for my innocent granddaughter. I wanted to make absolutely certain that the vicious cycle of selfish greed and calculated cruelty stopped right at my front door. I wanted to ensure that little Lily would grow up knowing what true unconditional love and absolute safety really look like. A real parent or grandparent does not just provide food and shelter. They stand as a heavy shield between their children and the absolute worst evils of the world, even if that evil happens to share their own last name. If this old father's relentless fight for his granddaughter resonated with your heart today, I would be incredibly grateful if you hit the like button right now. Please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any more true stories of resilience, family, and ultimate justice. And before you go about your day, please leave a comment down below. Let me know exactly what state you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. This old mechanic loves knowing exactly where the good, honest, and fiercely protective people of the world are standing today. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and please always remember to stand strong and protect the innocent ones who depend on you.